Grizzly bear devours 28-year-old newlywed on honeymoon. May 7th, 2025. The morning of May 5th, 2025, broke clear and cold over the Canadian Rockies, the kind of crystalline dawn that promised perfection to anyone foolish enough to believe the mountains could be anything other than indifferent to human hopes. Melissa Ann Grant, née Richardson, woke in the Fairmont Banff Springs Hotel to find her husband of exactly 48 hours sleeping beside her, his face peaceful in the pale light filtering through the heavy curtains. She had been Melissa Grant for 2 days, and the novelty of the name still sent a small thrill through her chest every time she thought it. Mrs. Andrew Grant, Melissa Grant. She tried it silently, her lips forming the words without sound, and smiled at the ceiling of their honeymoon suite. Andrew James Grant stirred beside her, his hand reaching out across the Egyptian cotton sheets to find her waist. At 31, he was 3 years older than Melissa, a software engineer for a Calgary-based energy company who had proposed to her on a camping trip in Kananaskis country the previous September. The engagement had been 6 months of joy, planning, last-minute adjustments to seating charts, arguments about flowers that seemed important at the time and ridiculous in retrospect, and finally, gloriously, a wedding on May 3rd at St. Mary's Cathedral in Calgary with 217 guests in attendance. Melissa's mother, Patricia Richardson, had cried through the entire ceremony. Melissa's father, Robert Richardson, a retired geologist who had spent 30 years working in the Alberta oil fields, had gripped Andrew's hand so hard during the rehearsal dinner that Andrew's fingers had gone numb, and told him in a voice thick with emotion that he was trusting him with his daughter's life. The hyperbole had seemed touching at the time. In retrospect, it would haunt Robert Richardson for the rest of his days. They had chosen Banff for their honeymoon because both of them loved the mountains. Melissa, who had grown up in Calgary, had spent her childhood summers hiking with her family through Banff and Jasper National Parks. She was a pediatric nurse at Alberta Children's Hospital, specializing in oncology, and she brought to her work the same fierce protectiveness she brought to everything she loved. Her colleagues described her as someone who would fight death itself for her patients, a woman who stayed late and came in early, who remembered birthdays and brought homemade cookies to families keeping vigil in the ICU. She had dark brown hair that she wore long, hazel eyes that changed color with her moods, and a laugh that her best friend, Jennifer Caldwell, described as infectious and impossible to resist. Andrew was quieter, more reserved, the kind of man who thought carefully before speaking and chose his words with precision. His colleagues at Suncor Energy respected his methodical approach to problem-solving, his ability to debug complex systems through patience and logic. He had grown up in Red Deer, the middle child of 3 boys, and had learned early to find peace in solitude. Hiking had become his meditation, his escape from the noise of family life and later from the demands of his career. When he met Melissa at a mutual friend's barbecue in the summer of 2022, he had been struck not just by her beauty, but by her energy, the way she seemed to radiate life and warmth. She had coaxed him out of his shell over the following months, teaching him to be less serious, to laugh more freely, to take risks he would have avoided in his careful, calculated life. They had planned this honeymoon with the same attention to detail they had brought to the wedding. 5 days in Banff, staying at the castle like Fairmont with its stone turrets and panoramic views. They would hike the trails they both knew well, Johnston Canyon, Tunnel Mountain, the Lake Agnes Tea House Trail. They would have dinner at the hotel's famous Rob Roy dining room, drink champagne in the mineral springs, make love with the mountains visible through their windows. It was meant to be perfect, and for the first 2 days, it had been. On the morning of May 5th, they ordered room service. Eggs Benedict for Melissa, a Western omelette for Andrew, fresh squeezed orange juice and coffee so dark it was almost black. They ate slowly, still reveling in the luxury of having nowhere to be, no obligations beyond pleasing themselves. Andrew suggested they hike the Cascade Amphitheatre Trail, a moderately difficult 12-kilometer round trip that would take them up into alpine meadows with views of Cascade Mountain and Mount Norquay. Melissa countered with the proposal that they tackle the Corey Pass Loop, a longer and more challenging hike that neither of them had completed before. "It's supposed to be incredible," she said, scrolling through photos on her phone, images of hikers standing against vast panoramas of jagged peaks and glacial valleys. 13 kilometers, rated hard, but we're in good shape. And look at these views, Andrew. Look at them. Andrew studied the photos, then pulled up the trail description on all trails. "Elevation gain of 920 meters," he read aloud. "Steep in sections. Potential for snow at higher elevations even in May. Says here it's not recommended for inexperienced hikers." "We're not inexperienced," Melissa said, setting down her coffee cup with a decisive clink. "We've been hiking these mountains our whole lives." "Come on. Don't be so cautious. We're young, we're fit, we're on our honeymoon. Let's do something memorable." Andrew looked at his wife, at the excitement in her eyes, the way her whole face lit up when she talked about the mountains, and he felt his careful objections melting away. This was why he loved her. She pushed him past his boundaries, made him live more fully than he would have on his own. "Okay," he said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Corey Pass it is." They spent the next hour preparing for the hike. Andrew checked their packs systematically, a habit ingrained from years of backcountry travel. 2 liters of water each in Camelback reservoirs. Energy bars, 6 of them, more than they would need for a day hike, but better to have too much than too little. First aid kit with bandages, antiseptic, pain relievers, tents or bandages for sprains. Emergency blanket, headlamps with extra batteries, even though they planned to be back long before dark. Bear spray, 2 canisters, 1 clipped to Andrew's belt and 1 in Melissa's pack. Whistle, compass and paper map as backup to their phones. Extra layers, because weather in the mountains could change without warning. "You're overthinking this," Melissa teased, watching him triple-check the contents of his pack. "It's a day hike, not an expedition to Everest. Just being prepared," Andrew replied, not looking up. "These mountains deserve respect." They dressed in layers, moisture-wicking base layers, fleece mid-layers, waterproof shells packed away in case of rain, hiking boots broken in over dozens of previous trails, hats and sunglasses against the high-altitude sun. Andrew wore his Garmin watch, which would track their progress and elevation. Melissa brought her Canon camera, a semi-professional DSLR she had saved for months to buy, eager to capture images of what promised to be spectacular scenery. They checked out of the hotel room at 9:47 a.m., leaving their larger suitcases with the concierge. The drive from the Fairmont to the Corey Pass trailhead was 23 kilometers along the Bow Valley Parkway, a scenic route that wound through forest and alongside the Bow River. Andrew drove their rented Toyota 4Runner, Melissa navigating and calling out wildlife. A herd of elk grazing in a meadow, 2 bighorn sheep on a rocky outcrop, a black bear disappearing into the trees far enough away to be no threat. "Black bear," Melissa said, marking it in the wildlife log she was keeping, a habit from childhood trips with her father. Adult, looked healthy. May 5th, 10:13 a.m., Bow Valley Parkway, approximately 8 kilometers west of Banff. "Did you see how fast it moved?" Andrew asked, watching the trees where the bear had vanished. "They look slow until you see them run." "That's why we have bear spray," Melissa said confidently. She had taken a bear safety course the previous year, part of a staff development program at the hospital that encouraged outdoor recreation. She knew the protocols: make noise while hiking, don't surprise a bear, back away slowly if encountered, use the spray only as a last resort, and only if the bear charged within 7 meters. Black bears were generally timid, more afraid of humans than humans were of them. Grizzlies were different, more aggressive, more territorial, but also much rarer in this part of the park. The statistics were on their side. Fatal bear attacks in North America averaged less than one per year. They were more likely to be struck by lightning or killed in a car accident driving to the trailhead than to be seriously injured by a bear. They arrived at the Corey Pass trailhead parking lot at 10:34 a.m. There were 3 other vehicles already there: a blue Subaru Outback with British Columbia plates, a white Ford F-150 with Alberta plates, and a silver Honda CR-V with a kayak strapped to the roof. Other hikers, which was reassuring. Bears tended to avoid areas with significant human activity. Andrew backed the 4Runner into a parking spot, force of habit to make for an easier exit, and they climbed out into mountain air that was sharp and clean and smelled of pine and stone and the faint mineral scent of snowmelt. The trailhead information board displayed a large topographical map of the area, warning signs about bear activity, and a reminder that all hikers were required to check current trail conditions and wildlife reports. Andrew photographed the map with his phone, while Melissa read the posted warnings. There had been a grizzly sighting on the trail 3 days earlier, on May 2nd, a sow with 2 cubs seen at approximately the 6-kilometer mark in the morning hours. The notice advised hikers to travel in groups, make noise, carry bear spray, and be prepared to turn back if they encountered bears or fresh sign of bear activity. 3 days ago, Melissa said, reading the date. They're probably long gone by now, and it says they saw them in the morning. It's almost 11 now. Different time of day. Andrew nodded slowly, studying the notice. Something about it unsettled him, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. A feeling, perhaps, or just his natural caution asserting itself. "We should be fine," he said, more to convince himself than to inform Melissa. "We'll make plenty of noise. And we're out of here by mid-afternoon, no matter what." They signed the trail register, a practice required in many Canadian national parks to help with search and rescue in case hikers went missing. Andrew filled in the form carefully. Names, Andrew Grant and Melissa Grant. Address, Calgary, Alberta, emergency contact. Patricia Richardson, Melissa's mother, with her phone number. Intended route, Corey Pass Loop. Expected return time, 4 p.m. He checked his watch as he wrote. It was 10:52 a.m. That gave them 5 hours, which should be more than sufficient for a 13-kilometer hike, even accounting for stops for photos and rest. The trail began easily, a wide path through lodgepole pine forest that climbed gradually alongside a creek. The sound of running water accompanied their first steps, and Melissa immediately fell into the rhythm she loved, the steady pace of hiking that was meditation and exercise and exploration all at once. She had clipped a small bell to her pack, a bear bell that chimed softly with each step, and Andrew periodically called out, "Hey, bear!" as they walked, his voice echoing through the trees. The forest was beautiful in the way that mountain forests are beautiful in late spring, still touched by winter, but alive with the promise of summer. Patches of snow lingered in shadowed areas beneath the trees. Wildflowers were beginning to emerge, glacier lilies pushing up through the last remnants of snow, their yellow petals bright against white. The air was cool but not cold, perfect hiking temperature, and within 15 minutes both of them had shed their outer layers and stuffed them into their packs. They encountered the first other hikers at the 1.2-kilometer mark, a couple in their 50s who were descending, already finished with their hike. The woman, wearing a bright red jacket and a University of British Columbia baseball cap, smiled warmly as they approached. "Beautiful day for it," she called out. "Gorgeous," Melissa agreed. "How was the trail?" "Stunning," the woman said. "Snow at the top, but passable." "We made it to the pass. The views are absolutely worth it. You two look like you're just starting out." "Just married," Melissa said, and the pride in her voice was unmistakable. She held up her left hand to display her wedding ring, a simple platinum band with 3 small diamonds. Honeymoon hike. "Congratulations," the woman said warmly. Her husband, a tall man with a greying beard, nodded his agreement. "That's wonderful. Well, you picked a hell of a trail for it. Literally took my breath away up there, and I don't think it was just the altitude." He paused, then added, "Saw some fresh tracks about 3 kilometers up, big ones, probably grizzly. Didn't see the bear itself, thank God, but might want to make some noise as you go." Andrew felt a chill, despite the exertion of hiking. "How fresh?" "Hard to say for sure. Day or 2, maybe?" The tracks crossed the trail in a muddy section, big paws, claws visible in the prints. My wife wanted to turn back right there, but I talked her into continuing. "We made a lot of noise, sang some songs, and didn't see anything, but just FYI." "Thanks for letting us know," Andrew said. He reached down and touched the bear spray canister on his belt, reassured by its presence. They hiked on, but Andrew's earlier unease had crystallized into something more concrete. Grizzly tracks, recent, on the trail they were now climbing. He knew the statistics. Grizzly bears were not actively hunting humans. Attacks were almost always defensive, the result of surprising a bear or coming between a sow and her cubs. But statistics were abstractions, and tracks in mud were concrete. There was a bear on this mountain somewhere, and they were walking into its territory. Melissa seemed less concerned. She was setting a brisk pace, her boots finding purchase on rocks and roots with practiced ease, her breathing steady despite the climbing. She had always been fit, ran half marathons for charity, did CrossFit 3 times a week. Andrew was in good shape himself, but he had to work to keep up with her, and he found himself focusing on the physical effort, letting it push aside his worry. At the 2.8-kilometer mark, the trail steepened significantly, switching back and forth up a mountainside in tight zigzags that had them both breathing harder. The forest began to thin, trees becoming shorter and more sparse as they gained elevation. Views started to open up behind them. Glimpses of the Bow Valley far below, the town of Banff small and distant, the Fairmont visible as a grey castle on a green mountainside. Melissa stopped periodically to photograph the vistas, composing shots with the care of someone who saw the world through a lens, who understood light and shadow and perspective. "Look at this," she called, and Andrew turned to see her framing a shot of him against the valley below, his figure small against the immensity of the landscape. "My mountain man," she teased, and he smiled despite himself, despite the small knot of worry that had taken up residence in his stomach. They reached the tracks at the 3.4-kilometer mark. The trail here crossed a section of exposed earth, muddy from snowmelt, and the tracks were unmistakable. Massive paw prints, each one nearly the size of a small dog of Andrew's spread hand, with claw marks extending several inches beyond the toe pads, 5 toes on each foot, the distinctive pattern of a bear, and the size and spacing suggested grizzly rather than black bear. The tracks came down from the slope above, crossed the trail at an angle, and continued downslope into the forest below. Andrew knelt beside the prints, examining them with the careful attention his profession had taught him to bring to complex problems. The edges of the prints were still relatively crisp, not yet degraded by weather or other foot traffic. 1 day old, maybe 2 at the outside. He looked up at Melissa, who had stopped beside him and was photographing the tracks. "Those are big," she said, and for the first time that day he heard uncertainty in her voice. "Very big," Andrew agreed. "Male, probably, or a large female." He stood scanning the forest above and below the trail. Nothing moved except branches swaying in the light breeze. No sound except the distant whisper of wind and the faint tinkle of Melissa's bear bell. "The couple we met said they continued after seeing these and didn't have any problems. And they're heading down," Melissa pointed out, "away from the pass." If the bear was here yesterday or the day before, it's probably miles away by now. Andrew wanted to turn back. Every instinct he had developed over years of careful living was telling him to retreat, to choose safety over ambition, to accept that some adventures weren't worth the risk. But he looked at Melissa, saw the determination in her eyes mixed with a question. Would he let fear stop them from experiencing something beautiful? And he made the decision that would define the rest of their lives. "We keep going," he said, "but we stay alert. We make noise constantly, and if we see anything at all that seems like fresh bear activity, we turn around immediately." "Deal." "Deal," Melissa said, and she kissed him, quick and warm, before shouldering her pack and continuing up the trail. They made noise. Andrew called out, "Hey, bear!" Every 30 seconds, his voice hoarse from the dry mountain air. Melissa sang pop songs from the radio, show tunes from musicals she had performed in during high school, anything to fill the silence with human sound that would warn any wildlife of their approach. The trail grew steeper still, and conversation became difficult as they both focused on the effort of climbing. At the 4-kilometer mark, they broke above tree line entirely. The landscape transformed from forest to alpine tundra, a vast expanse of rock and low vegetation with snow lingering in patches and drifts. The views were spectacular, exactly as advertised. Cascade Mountain rising to their north, the distinctive pyramid of Mount Louis to their south, and beyond, range after range of peaks stretching to the horizon in every direction. The wind was stronger here, cold and constant, and they stopped to put their jackets back on and to simply stand and absorb the magnitude of the landscape. "This is why we do this," Melissa said, her voice almost reverent. She had her camera out, shooting frame after frame, turning slowly to capture the full panorama. "This is why we come to the mountains. Nothing else matters up here. All the noise and stress and bullshit of regular life just disappears." Andrew nodded, because she was right, and for a moment his worry disappeared too, overwhelmed by the simple beauty of where they were and who he was with. This was their honeymoon, their celebration of commitment and love, and they were sharing it in one of the most beautiful places on earth. He pulled her close, and they stood together against the wind, two small figures in an enormous landscape, and for those few minutes, everything was perfect. They continued climbing. The trail here was less distinct, marked by cairns, small stacks of rocks left by previous hikers to indicate the route. The going was slower, requiring careful foot placement on loose scree and around patches of snow. Andrew checked his watch. It was 1:17 p.m. They had been hiking for 2.5 hours and had covered approximately 5 kilometers, which meant they were moving more slowly than he had anticipated. The pass itself was still another 1.5 kilometers ahead, and then they would need to descend via a different route to complete the loop. "We're making good time," Melissa said, reading his thoughts. She had stopped to drink from her camelback, the tube snaking over her shoulder, and was studying the route ahead. "I can see the pass from here. That saddle between the two peaks. 45 minutes, maybe an hour to get there. And then we need to descend," Andrew reminded her. "It's going to be a long day." "Best day of my life so far," Melissa said, grinning at him. "Well, second best. The wedding was pretty great too. They ate energy bars, standing up, not wanting to sit on the cold, wet ground. Andrew's bar was chocolate chip, Melissa's was blueberry, and they traded halves, a small intimacy that made them both smile. Around them, the alpine tundra was dotted with small flowers, white mountain avens, purple saxifrage, tiny dots of color against rock and snow. A pika, a small rabbit-like mammal adapted to high elevations, watched them from atop a boulder, its round ears alert, before disappearing into a crack in the rocks with a sharp squeak. They were alone on the mountain. They had seen no other hikers since the couple descending near the start of the trail, no sign of human presence except for the cairns marking the route. The solitude was part of the appeal, but it also meant there was no one else around to provide the safety of numbers, no one else making noise to alert wildlife. Andrew found himself scanning the slope constantly, looking for movement, for any sign of the bear whose tracks they had seen below. At 2:03 p.m., they reached the pass. Kauri Pass, elevation 2,350 meters above sea level, a narrow saddle of rock and snow between two peaks with views that defied description. To the east, the way they had come, the Bow Valley stretched away into the distance. To the west, the trail descended into a different valley, steep and rocky, with a small alpine lake visible far below, its surface still mostly frozen despite the late spring date. The wind at the pass was fierce, strong enough that they had to lean into it, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. Andrew estimated it was no more than 3 or 4 degrees Celsius up here, cold enough that their breath misted in the air. Melissa was ecstatic, her face flushed from exertion and excitement. She immediately began setting up shots, positioning Andrew against various backdrops, then setting the camera on her pack with the self-timer and rushing to join him for couple photos. They took turns photographing each other, documenting their achievement, proof that they had done this together. Other hikers had left their marks. Cairns, a small pile of prayer flags fluttering in the wind, initials scratched into rocks. Melissa pulled out a Sharpie and wrote on a smooth stone, "A plus M5-5-25, before adding it to one of the cairns. They stayed at the pass for 20 minutes, sheltering from the wind behind a larger boulder to eat more energy bars and drink water. Andrew used his phone to check the GPS, confirming their position and studying the descent route. The way down looked steep, with several sections that would require careful navigation. His watch showed they had been hiking for 3 hours and 16 minutes, which meant it was now 2:23 p.m. If the descent took 2 hours, a conservative estimate, they would be back at the trailhead by 4:30 p.m., half an hour later than he had listed on the trail register, but still well within a reasonable margin of error. "Ready to head down?" he asked Melissa, who was taking a final series of photos, trying to capture the play of light and shadow on the peaks across the valley. "Ready," she said, and they began the descent. The western side of Kauri Pass dropped away more steeply than the route they had climbed. The trail, such as it was, consisted of a series of tight switchbacks through loose rock, each turn requiring careful attention to avoid slipping. Within the first 100 meters of descent, both of them had stumbled, catching themselves before falling, but serving as reminders of how quickly things could go wrong in the mountains. Andrew took the lead, moving slowly, testing each foothold before committing his weight, calling back warnings to Melissa about loose rocks or particularly tricky sections. The descent consumed their attention entirely. There was no more singing, no more calling out bear warnings, just the intense focus required to navigate difficult terrain. They dropped back below treeline at approximately 2:51 p.m., entering a sparse forest of subalpine fir and whitebark pine, twisted trees shaped by wind and winter. The trail became more defined here, though still steep, winding down through the trees toward the valley below. At 3:14 p.m., they encountered the bear. Andrew saw it first, a flicker of movement through the trees about 40 meters downslope from the trail. He stopped so abruptly that Melissa, following close behind, nearly collided with him. "Bear," he said, his voice tight and pointed. The grizzly was massive, easily 250 kilograms, possibly more. Its coat was a rich brown, with silver-tipped guard hairs that caught the filtered sunlight, giving it an almost luminous quality. It was moving parallel to the trail, its gait a rolling walk that covered ground with deceptive speed. Its huge head swung from side to side as it moved, nose testing the air, and even from this distance, Andrew could see the distinctive shoulder hump and dished facial profile that marked it as a grizzly rather than a black bear. They froze. Every piece of bear safety information Andrew had ever learned flooded his mind simultaneously. Make yourself big, back away slowly, don't run, don't make eye contact, speak in calm tones, use the spray only if charged. His hand moved automatically to the bear spray on his belt. Thumb finding the safety clip, but he didn't draw it, not yet. The bear hadn't seen them, or if it had, it was choosing to ignore them, focused on whatever had drawn it into this part of the valley. Melissa was rigid beside him, barely breathing. Her hand found his, squeezed hard enough to hurt. They stood that way for what felt like hours, but was probably less than a minute, watching the bear move through the trees below them. It paused once, lifting its massive head to sniff the air, and Andrew's heart hammered so hard he was certain the bear would hear it. But then the animal continued on its way, moving gradually farther from the trail, deeper into the forest. When the bear had been out of sight for a full 2 minutes, Andrew finally allowed himself to breathe normally. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay, that's our sign. We're out of here." "It's moving away," Melissa whispered, still gripping his hand. "Should we wait longer? Give it more time to get farther away?" "No," Andrew said firmly. "We move now, while we know where it is. We make noise, we move quickly but carefully, and we get the hell off this mountain." They began descending again, but everything had changed. The hike was no longer an adventure, but a retreat, their previous confidence replaced by hypervigilance. Andrew led, calling out constantly now, his voice too loud in the quiet forest. But loud was good, loud was safe. Melissa followed close enough that he could hear her breathing, rapid and shallow with adrenaline. The trail descended through the trees in a series of switchbacks, losing elevation quickly. Andrew's legs were beginning to burn from the sustained downhill hiking, his knees protesting the constant impact. He checked his watch compulsively. 3:27 p.m., 3:34 p.m., 3:41 p.m., marking their progress by time because he couldn't focus on distance. They just needed to get down, to get back to the trailhead, to get into the Forerunner and drive away from this mountain. At 3:46 p.m., they reached a small clearing where the trail crossed a creek. The creek was perhaps 2 meters wide, running fast with snowmelt, clear water tumbling over rounded stones. A simple log bridge crossed it, but the log was wet and looked slippery. Andrew tested it carefully before committing his weight, then crossed quickly and turned to help Melissa. She was halfway across when they heard the sound. It came from upslope, back the way they had come, and it was like nothing Andrew had ever heard before, a deep, resonant huffing that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Not a growl, not exactly, but a sound that communicated threat more clearly than any words could have. The sound of a large animal, close, agitated, aware of them. Melissa's eyes went wide. She rushed the last few steps across the log, stumbled on the far end, and Andrew caught her arm to steady her. They stood in the clearing, listening, and the huffing came again, louder, closer, definitely upslope, but moving toward them with terrifying speed. "Run," Andrew said, and they ran. Later, every expert they spoke to would tell them this was the wrong decision. Running triggers a predator's chase instinct, makes you prey, transforms a potentially neutral encounter into an attack. They should have stood their ground, grouped together, prepared to use their bear spray if the bear showed itself. But in that moment, with adrenaline flooding their systems and the sound of a huge predator rushing toward them through the forest, rational thought evaporated. And they did what millions of years of evolution had programmed them to do when facing a threat larger and stronger than themselves. They fled. The trail descended steeply from the clearing, and they took it at a dangerous pace, boots slipping on loose rock and exposed roots. Melissa was faster, younger, and she pulled ahead despite Andrew's longer legs. Behind them, the sound of the bear was unmistakable now, branches breaking, heavy footfalls. The huffing turned to a sound that might have been a roar. It was chasing them. The grizzly they had seen below the trail, or another one, it didn't matter which, had decided they were a threat or prey, or simply something to be pursued. And it was coming. Andrew risked a glance back and saw it, a brown mass moving through the trees with impossible speed, 50 meters behind and closing the distance fast. Its mouth was open, teeth visible, ears laid back flat against its skull. A grizzly in full charge is one of the fastest land animals in North America over short distances, capable of reaching speeds of 55 kilometers per hour, and this one was using every bit of that speed. "Melissa!" he screamed, and she looked back, saw the bear, and her face transformed into an expression of pure terror. Andrew's mind was racing through options, even as his legs pumped beneath him. They couldn't outrun it, that was clear. The trailhead was still kilometers away. They needed to stop, to stand and fight, to use the bear spray. He fumbled for the canister on his belt, got it free, but the safety clip was still engaged, and his hands were shaking so hard he couldn't manipulate it while running. The trail ahead forked. The main path continued descending to the left, but a narrower track split off to the right, leading into denser forest. Without conscious thought, Andrew veered right and Melissa followed. Maybe the trees would slow the bear. Maybe they could find a place to make a stand. Maybe... The bear was 30 meters behind them. 20 meters. Its paws were the size of dinner plates, its claws like curved knives. Andrew could hear its breathing now, could smell it, a musky, wild scent that was utterly alien and utterly terrifying. Melissa tripped. It happened so fast that Andrew's mind couldn't process it in real time. One moment she was running ahead of him, the next she was tumbling forward, her boot caught on a root or rock, her body pitching toward the ground. She tried to catch herself, hands outstretched, but her momentum was too great. She hit hard, a full-body impact that drove the air from her lungs in an explosive gasp and skidded several feet across the trail surface before coming to rest. Andrew was beside her instantly, hauling her to her feet, but she was stunned, disoriented, not fully responsive. He got her upright, tried to push her forward, but her left ankle buckled beneath her weight, and she cried out in pain, sprained, possibly broken, and the bear was 15 meters away, 10 meters, coming at them like a freight train. Andrew stepped in front of his wife. He got the safety clip off the bear spray finally, his thumb working by instinct rather than conscious thought, and raised the canister. The bear was a wall of brown fur and muscle and rage, close enough now that Andrew could see its eyes, small and dark and fixed on them with single-minded intensity. He pressed the trigger at 5 meters. The spray deployed in a pressurized cloud of capsaicin, the active ingredient in chili peppers, concentrated to a level that could stop any animal in its tracks. The reddish mist enveloped the bear's face, and for a moment, Andrew thought it had worked, thought they were saved, because the grizzly slowed, shaking its head, its paws coming up to scrub at its eyes and nose. But it didn't stop. The spray had hit, had clearly affected the bear, but whether from momentum or rage or sheer determination, the grizzly kept coming. It burst through the dispersing cloud of spray, and its paw, moving almost too fast to see, struck Andrew in the chest. The impact was like being hit by a car. Andrew's feet left the ground, his body lifted and thrown backward by a force that was casual for the bear, but devastating for him. He flew nearly 3 meters, slammed into a tree trunk with enough force to crack ribs, and dropped to the ground in a crumpled heap. His vision went white, then black, then slowly resolved into blurred shapes and colors. He tried to breathe and couldn't, his diaphragm spasming from the impact. The bear spray canister was gone, knocked from his hand, lying somewhere out of reach. Through the haze of pain and shock, Andrew heard Melissa scream. The grizzly had turned its attention to her. She was still on the ground where she had fallen, trying to crawl away but hampered by her injured ankle. The bear loomed over her, its bulk blocking out the sky, and its jaws opened wide, revealing teeth that were yellowed and massive, and designed to tear flesh from bone. Melissa did the only thing she could think to do. She curled into a fetal position, hands clasped behind her neck, knees drawn up to protect her vital organs, exactly as the bear safety course had taught her. Playing dead, hoping the bear would recognize she was no threat and leave her alone. The bear's jaws closed on her upper back. Andrew, watching from where he lay broken against the tree, heard the sound of fabric tearing, then skin tearing, then something deeper, muscle or bone or both. Melissa's scream cut off abruptly, replaced by a gurgling sound that was somehow more horrifying than any scream. The grizzly shook its head, the way a dog shakes a toy, and Melissa's body came off the ground, limp and ragdoll, blood spraying in an arc that caught the late afternoon light. "No!" Andrew tried to shout, but it came out as barely a whisper. He tried to stand, to go to her, to do something, anything, but his body wouldn't respond. His left arm was useless, hanging at an unnatural angle, broken or dislocated. His ribs grated with every attempted breath, and when he coughed, blood flecked his lips. Punctured lung, some distant clinical part of his mind diagnosed, even as he watched the woman he loved being killed by a monster in front of his eyes. The bear dropped Melissa, and she fell in a heap, not moving. Blood was pooling beneath her, spreading across the rocky trail in a dark stain. The grizzly looked down at her for a long moment, as if assessing whether she was still a threat, and then it turned its attention to Andrew. It walked toward him with that same rolling gait he had observed from a safe distance earlier, but now there was nothing between them. No distance. No safety. The bear's face was still wet with the spray, its eyes squinted and watering, but it could clearly still see him, still smell him, still know he was there. It stopped a meter away, its head massive and close, and lowered its nose toward Andrew's face. Andrew could feel the bear's breath, hot and foul, could see its nostrils flare as it scented him. Time seemed to slow. He thought of his parents, of his brothers, of whether they would understand how he died. He thought of Melissa's mother, Patricia, and how he had promised to protect her daughter. He thought, oddly, of the wedding 2 days ago, of dancing with Melissa to At Last by Etta James, of how happy she had looked, how certain of their future together. The bear huffed once more, its breath washing over Andrew's face, and then, inexplicably, it turned away. It walked back to where Melissa lay, sniffed her body once, and then moved off the trail into the forest, disappearing into the trees with the same casual power with which it had appeared. Andrew lay against the tree, breathing in shallow, painful gasps, listening to the sound of the bear moving away through the undergrowth until even that faded into silence. His vision was tunneling, black, closing in from the edges, and he fought to stay conscious, knowing that if he passed out now, they would both die on this mountain. "Melissa," he whispered, and began to crawl toward her. Every movement was agony. His ribs shifted with each breath, sending lightning bolts of pain through his chest. His left arm dragged uselessly, leaving a trail through the dirt and pine needles. It took him minutes to cover the few meters to where she lay, minutes during which he kept expecting to hear the bear returning, kept expecting to feel its jaws closing on his own back. When he reached Melissa, the extent of the damage was immediately, horrifically clear. The bear's initial bite had torn through her jacket and shirt, through skin and muscle, exposing white glimpses of vertebrae. Blood was everywhere, soaking her clothes, pooling beneath her, bright arterial red mixing with darker venous blood. Her face was turned away from him, pressed against the ground, and he couldn't tell if she was breathing. "Melissa," he said again, louder this time, reaching out with his good hand to touch her shoulder. "Melissa, baby, please." She moved. It was just a finger twitching against the ground, but it was movement, was life, and Andrew felt a surge of desperate hope. She was alive, hurt, maybe dying, but alive. He knew he needed help, needed it now, needed it desperately. His phone. Where was his phone? He had put it in his jacket pocket, but the impact with the tree had been so violent that he couldn't be sure it was still there. He patted his jacket frantically with his good hand, felt the rectangular shape, pulled it out with fingers that were slick with blood. His or Melissa's, he couldn't tell. The screen was cracked but functional. He pressed the power button, and it lit up, showing 3:58 p.m. and 3 bars of signal. 3 bars. Enough. He dialed 911, his thumb leaving bloody smears on the screen, and pressed the phone to his ear. It rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, a woman's voice answered, calm and professional. 911, what's your emergency? Bear attack, Andrew said, and his voice was stronger now, adrenaline and desperation giving him strength he shouldn't have had. Grizzly bear, my wife is hurt bad. We're on Corey Pass Trail, western descent, maybe 6 or 7 kilometers from the trailhead. She's bleeding. She needs help now. Sir, I need you to stay calm, the dispatcher said, and Andrew could hear her typing, alerting emergency services, setting in motion the rescue operation that might save Melissa's life. What's your name? Andrew Grant. My wife is Melissa Grant. We're on our honeymoon. He said this last part and realized how absurd it sounded, how grotesque. She's not moving. There's so much blood. Is she breathing? Andrew leaned close to Melissa's face, his own breath catching as he tried to focus through the pain and shock. He couldn't tell. He put his good hand on her back, carefully near her shoulder where the fabric was intact, and felt the slight rise and fall of her ribcage. Yes, shallow. Very shallow. Okay, Andrew, that's good. That's very good. I need you to assess her injuries. Can you do that for me? Her back. The bear bit her back, by her shoulder blades. It's torn open. I can see bone, and she hit her head when she fell. There's blood in her hair. He was crying now, he realized, tears running down his face, mixing with dirt and blood and fear. Is the bear still there? No. It left. It left. Okay. I'm dispatching Banff Park EMS and the mountain rescue team right now. They'll be there as soon as possible, but, Andrew, I need to be honest with you. It's going to take time to reach your location. You said western descent of Corey Pass? That's remote. They're going to come by helicopter, but even helicopter response time is going to be at least 30 minutes, maybe more, depending on aircraft availability. 30 minutes. Melissa had 30 minutes to not die. Andrew looked at the blood pooling beneath her and knew with certainty that she didn't have 30 minutes, not without intervention. Tell me what to do, he said to the dispatcher, forcing his voice to remain steady. I can help her. Tell me what to do. The dispatcher's voice became more focused, slipping into the calm, directive tone of someone who had talked people through crises before. First, do you have any first aid supplies? Yes. First aid kit in my pack. His pack had remained on his back through the attack, though it was twisted around now, the straps cutting into his shoulders. He reached back awkwardly, got the zipper open, and dumped the contents on the ground beside Melissa. The first aid kit tumbled out along with water bottles, energy bar wrappers, his spare jacket. Good. I need you to address the bleeding. Find the largest wound and apply direct pressure with whatever you have, gauze, clothing, anything absorbent. Andrew opened the first aid kit with shaking hands. It contained standard supplies, adhesive bandages in various sizes, a roll of gauze, medical tape, antiseptic wipes, a small bottle of pain reliever, laughably inadequate for what was needed. The gauze was a single roll, maybe 3 meters long when unrolled. Melissa's wound was the size of both his hands put together, a ragged tear that was still bleeding steadily, despite the pooling blood that suggested she had already lost a dangerous amount. He unrolled the gauze, pressed the entire length of it against the wound on her back, and pushed down. Melissa moaned, a low sound of pain that simultaneously broke Andrew's heart and gave him hope. She was conscious enough to feel pain, which meant her brain was still functioning. But the gauze immediately saturated with blood, turning from white to red in seconds. "It's not enough," he told the dispatcher, hearing the panic creeping back into his voice. "The bleeding isn't stopping. Use your jacket, take it off and press it against the wound. You need bulk and pressure, Andrew. Can you do that?" He stripped off his jacket, the movement sending fresh waves of pain through his broken ribs, and pressed the wadded fabric against Melissa's back. She cried out, louder this time, and tried weakly to move away from the pressure. "I'm sorry," Andrew whispered to her, to himself, to the universe that had let this happen. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Andrew, talk to me," the dispatcher said. "How's the bleeding?" "Slowing, I think." Maybe. He couldn't actually tell. There was so much blood already that it was impossible to judge whether new blood was flowing or if he was just seeing what had already spilled. "How long until they get here?" "The helicopter is lifting off now. ETA, 28 minutes to your location. 28 minutes. Forever. A lifetime." Andrew kept pressure on the wound with his good hand, his broken arm hanging useless at his side, his own blood dripping steadily from cuts he hadn't noticed he'd sustained. The sun was lower in the sky now, the light taking on the golden quality of late afternoon, moving toward evening. The temperature was dropping. If they were still out here after dark, if Melissa was still bleeding in the cold. "Stay with me, baby," he said to Melissa, not knowing if she could hear him. "Help is coming. You're going to be okay. You're going to be fine. Just stay with me." He talked to her continuously, filling the terrible silence with words, with promises, with memories. He told her about the first time he saw her at that barbecue, how she had been wearing a blue sundress and laughing at something their friend's dog was doing. He told her about their first date, coffee that had turned into dinner, that had turned into walking around downtown Calgary until midnight, neither of them wanting the evening to end. He told her about the proposal, how terrified he had been that she would say no, despite the fact that they had been dating for 3 years and had talked about marriage dozens of times. The dispatcher stayed on the line, occasionally asking Andrew questions, taking vitals when he could provide them, offering reassurance that help was coming. Andrew could hear her coordinating with other agencies, speaking in codes and abbreviations he didn't understand. Parks Canada was being notified. A wildlife attack team was being dispatched. Police were being sent to notify next of kin. Next of kin. Melissa's parents. The call that would destroy their lives. At 4:19 p.m. Andrew heard the helicopter. It was distant at first, just a faint whoop, whoop, whoop that might have been his imagination or his damaged ears playing tricks, but it grew steadily louder, more distinct, more real. The most beautiful sound Andrew had ever heard. Help, rescue, hope. "I hear them," he told the dispatcher, and his voice broke on the words. "They see you," she replied. "They've got your location from the GPS in your phone. They're going to land as close as they can. Stay where you are, Andrew. You've done so well. Just a few more minutes." The helicopter appeared over the tree line, a red and white Bell 407 with Banff Parks Rescue emblazoned on its side. It circled once, the pilot assessing the terrain, looking for a safe landing zone. The clearing where the trail crossed the creek, Andrew realized that's where they would land. Maybe 60 meters from where he and Melissa lay. So close, almost over. The helicopter descended into the clearing, its rotors whipping the trees into a frenzy, sending pine needles and small branches flying in the rotor wash. It touched down, and before the skids were fully settled, people were jumping out. Three figures in orange jumpsuits carrying equipment, moving toward Andrew's position with practiced urgency. The first to reach them was a woman in her 40s, her dark hair pulled back in a braid, her face set in an expression of focused concentration. "Andrew Grant," she called out as she approached. "Yes," he managed, his voice barely audible over the helicopter's idling rotors. She knelt beside them, her hands already moving to assess Melissa's condition, checking her pulse at her neck, examining the wound on her back. "I'm Sarah Chen, lead paramedic. My team's here to help. What's your wife's name?" "Melissa." "Okay, Melissa," Sarah said, speaking loudly and clearly even though it wasn't clear if Melissa could hear her. "My name is Sarah, and I'm going to take care of you. Andrew, I need you to keep that pressure on her back while my team gets equipment set up. Can you do that for me?" "Yes," Andrew said, pushing down on his jacket despite the pain in his ribs that was now so intense that spots were dancing in his vision. The other two paramedics arrived with equipment, a backboard, medical bags, a portable oxygen tank. One of them, a young man with red hair and freckles, immediately began setting up an IV line. The other, an older man with grey at his temples, began cutting away what remained of Melissa's jacket and shirt to get better access to the wound. "Jesus," the older paramedic muttered when he saw the full extent of the damage. Full-thickness tissue loss, exposed vertebrae, massive blood loss. "She's shocky. We need to move fast." Sarah was already working, her hands sure and steady. She had Melissa on oxygen within seconds, a mask over her face, and was calling out vitals to her team. "BP is 70/40, pulse is 132, respirations 12 and shallow. She's in class 4 hemorrhagic shock. We need volume replacement now, and we need to get her packaged and in the air in under 5 minutes." They worked with controlled urgency, a choreography of emergency medicine that Andrew watched as if from a great distance. They got 2 large-bore IV lines into Melissa's arms, started running fluids to replace the blood she had lost. They packed the wound on her back with trauma dressings, layers and layers of absorbent material held in place with pressure bandages. They immobilized her spine with a cervical collar and strapped her to the backboard with practiced efficiency. And through it all, Melissa didn't move, didn't respond, just lay there breathing those shallow, struggling breaths that sounded like they might stop at any moment. "What about you?" Sarah asked Andrew suddenly, turning her attention to him for the first time. "You're injured too." "I'm okay," Andrew lied. "Just help her. You're bleeding from your mouth, your arm is either broken or dislocated, and you're holding your ribs like they're made of glass. You're not okay." She gestured to the younger paramedic. "Tom, do a quick assessment on the husband while we finish packaging the wife." Tom moved to Andrew's side, began running through a rapid trauma evaluation, checking his pupils, his pulse, his breathing. "Likely pneumothorax on the left," he said, after listening to Andrew's chest with a stethoscope. "Definitely broken ribs, multiple by the feel of it. Left shoulder is dislocated, radial pulse is present, so no vascular compromise. Facial lacerations, possible concussion. He needs hospital evaluation, but he's stable enough to wait for the second bird." "Second bird?" Andrew asked, confused. "We can only take one critical patient at a time in the helicopter," Sarah explained, still working on Melissa. "Your wife is critical, so she goes first. We've already called for a second helicopter for you. It'll be here in 15 minutes. "I want to go with her," Andrew said, trying to stand, but Tom put a hand on his shoulder, holding him in place with surprising firmness. "You can't. There's no room, and we need to work on her during transport. The second helicopter will take you to the same hospital. You'll see her there, I promise." They lifted Melissa on the backboard, 4 of them carrying her in a smooth, coordinated movement toward the helicopter. Andrew watched them load her into the aircraft, watched Sarah climb in beside her, watched the younger paramedic secure equipment while the pilot increased throttle. The rotors spun faster, and the helicopter lifted off, rising above the trees, banking toward the east. toward Banff, toward the hospital where surgeons were being called in, operating rooms prepared, where Melissa would either live or die in the next few hours. Andrew sat on the cold ground next to a pool of his wife's blood and waited for his own rescue. Tom stayed with him, along with the older paramedic whose name turned out to be Richard. They worked on Andrew with the same efficiency they had brought to Melissa's care, though with less urgency. Richard splinted Andrew's dislocated shoulder, a procedure so painful that Andrew nearly blacked out, then bound his ribs with an elastic wrap to provide support. Tom cleaned the lacerations on Andrew's face and hands, applied antiseptic, placed bandages. They started an IV line, gave him pain medication that took the edge off, but didn't eliminate the grinding ache in his chest and shoulder. "The bear," Andrew said suddenly, the thought occurring to him for the first time since the initial attack. "It's still out there. What if it comes back?" Richard nodded, acknowledging the concern. "Parks Canada Wildlife Team is en route. They'll track and assess the bear. Sometimes after an attack like this, the bear has to be destroyed. It's already shown aggressive behavior toward humans, and it could attack again. Sometimes they determine it was defensive behavior and the bear gets relocated. But that's not your concern right now. The pilot reported our position before landing, and the wildlife team knows to stay clear until we're extracted." The second helicopter arrived at 4:47 p.m., 28 minutes after the first one had departed. It was a smaller aircraft, with room for only one patient and 2 crew members. They loaded Andrew on a stretcher, secured him, and lifted off into the evening sky. Through the helicopter's window, Andrew could see the trail below, could see the clearing where he and Melissa had been attacked, the dark stain on the ground that was her blood. Then the helicopter banked, and the clearing disappeared behind the trees, and all Andrew could see was mountains stretching in every direction, beautiful and indifferent and deadly. The flight to Banff took 11 minutes. Andrew watched the landscape pass below, forest and meadow, rivers and lakes, the town of Banff appearing with its grid of streets and buildings, and then the hospital, a modern structure on the edge of town with a helipad on its roof marked with a large red cross. The helicopter settled onto the pad, and the doors opened, and suddenly there were more hands reaching for him, more voices giving instructions, more urgent movement as he was transferred from the helicopter to a gurney and rushed inside. The interior of the hospital was bright and warm after the cold of the mountain. Fluorescent lights passed overhead as they wheeled him through corridors, and voices called out medical information: blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen saturation. They brought him to a trauma bay, transferred him to a bed, began cutting away his clothes to assess his injuries more thoroughly. A nurse placed a pulse oximeter on his finger. Another nurse hung fresh IV bags. A doctor with kind eyes and grey hair leaned over him and asked him to describe what had happened. Andrew told him about the hike, about the tracks, about the bear appearing and the chase, and Melissa falling and the attack. He told it mechanically, without emotion, because emotion would have broken him, and he needed to hold together, needed to be strong for whatever came next. "Your wife is in surgery right now," the doctor, his name tag read Dr. Michael Zhang, trauma surgery, told him when Andrew had finished. "She arrived about 30 minutes ago, and they took her directly to the OR. The surgical team is led by Dr. Kathleen Morrison, who is one of the best trauma surgeons in Alberta. They're doing everything they can." "Will she live?" Andrew asked, the question that had been burning in his mind since the moment the bear's jaws had closed on Melissa's back. Dr. Zhang met his eyes, and Andrew saw in that gaze the terrible honesty that doctors sometimes have to deliver. "I don't know," he said quietly. "She's lost a tremendous amount of blood, and the damage to her back is extensive. The next few hours are critical, but she's young, she's healthy, and she has a chance. We'll know more when Dr. Morrison finishes the surgery." They worked on Andrew for the next 2 hours. X-rays revealed 3 broken ribs on his left side, one of which had indeed punctured his lung, causing a small pneumothorax that required a chest tube to drain the air that had collected in his chest cavity. The shoulder dislocation was reduced, pulled and manipulated back into place in a procedure that, even with pain medication, made Andrew cry out. The lacerations on his face and hands were cleaned and sutured. They ran blood tests, a CT scan of his head and chest, an EKG to ensure his heart hadn't been damaged by the trauma. Through it all, Andrew kept asking about Melissa. The nurses gave him updates when they had them. She was still in surgery, still stable. The surgeons were working to repair the damage. But there was no definitive news, no word on whether she would survive, and the uncertainty was its own form of torture. At 7:23 p.m., a woman in surgical scrubs came into Andrew's room. She was tall, probably in her mid-50s, with short grey hair and the exhausted bearing of someone who had just finished a difficult task. Dr. Kathleen Morrison. Andrew knew immediately why she was there, and his heart began to race, the monitors beside his bed beeping faster in response to his elevated pulse. "Mr. Grant," Dr. Morrison said, and she pulled a chair close to his bed and sat down, which Andrew knew was a bad sign. Doctors sat down when they had difficult news to deliver. "I'm Dr. Morrison. I've just finished operating on your wife." "Is she alive?" Andrew asked, because he couldn't bear any preamble, couldn't endure carefully chosen words leading up to terrible news. "She's alive," Dr. Morrison said, and Andrew felt tears streaming down his face, felt relief so intense it was almost painful. "But her condition is critical, and I need to be very honest with you about what we're facing." She explained the injuries with clinical precision. The bear's bite had caused massive soft tissue damage to Melissa's upper back, destroying muscle and fascia, exposing her scapula and portions of her thoracic vertebrae. The initial blood loss had pushed her into hemorrhagic shock. During surgery, they had discovered damage to one of her lungs, a bite puncture that had collapsed the lower lobe. They had repaired what they could, removed tissue that was too damaged to save, and now faced the challenge of preventing infection in a wound that was essentially an open cavity in her back. "We've started her on broad-spectrum antibiotics," Dr. Morrison continued, "but bear mouths are essentially cesspools of bacteria. The risk of infection is extremely high. We're going to need to do multiple surgical debridements over the next few days, going back in to remove any tissue that becomes necrotic or infected. It's going to be a long recovery, Mr. Grant, and there are no guarantees. She could develop sepsis. She could have organ failure from the shock and blood loss. Her neurological status is uncertain. She wasn't conscious during or after the surgery, and we won't know the extent of any brain injury until she wakes up." "Can I see her?" Andrew asked. "She's in the ICU. They're getting her settled, and then, yes, you can see her, but she's on a ventilator, sedated, with more lines and tubes than you can imagine. It's going to be difficult to see her that way. Are you prepared for that?" Andrew nodded, even though he wasn't prepared, couldn't possibly be prepared for what he was about to witness. They moved him to a regular room first, out of the trauma bay, and into a quieter section of the hospital. A nurse helped him into a wheelchair. He wasn't cleared to walk yet with his injuries, and then wheeled him through the corridors to the intensive care unit. The ICU was a hushed space, all beeping monitors and hushed voices, and the constant background whir of machines. Melissa was in a private room, number 7, and when they wheeled Andrew to the doorway, he stopped, unable for a moment to process what he was seeing. Melissa lay in the center of a hospital bed, dwarfed by equipment. A ventilator breathed for her, the machine cycling with a rhythmic whoosh-click-whoosh that measured her life in mechanical breaths. 4 lines ran into both arms, dripping clear fluids and medications and blood. A catheter drained urine into a bag hanging from the bed frame. Monitor leads ran from her chest to machines that displayed her heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, all the numbers that indicated she was alive, but not how close she remained to death. Her face was almost unrecognizable. She was swollen from the massive fluid resuscitation she had received, her features puffy and distorted. Her skin was pale, bloodless grey beneath the fluorescent lights. Her hair, usually so carefully maintained, was matted with blood and dirt that the surgical team hadn't had time to clean. And her back, what Andrew could see of it through the gown, was wrapped in bandages so thick they looked like a second pillow beneath her. A nurse was at her bedside, a young woman with kind eyes who introduced herself as Rachel. "You can talk to her," Rachel said softly. "Even if she can't respond, hearing your voice might help." Andrew wheeled himself to Melissa's side, took her hand in his, the one not pierced by IV lines, and held it. Her skin was warm, which was somehow surprising and comforting. Warm meant alive, meant blood still flowing, heart still beating. "I'm here," he told her, his voice breaking. "I'm right here, Mel. You're going to be okay. You have to be okay. We just got married. We're supposed to have 50 years together, remember? You promised me 50 years. She didn't respond, didn't move, just lay there breathing with the machine, and Andrew sat beside her as the evening turned to night outside the hospital windows, holding her hand and willing her to survive. Patricia and Robert Richardson arrived at 9:47 p.m., having driven from Calgary at speeds that Robert later admitted bordered on reckless. They burst into the ICU in a state of near hysteria, Patricia's face streaked with tears, Robert looking 10 years older than he had at the wedding 3 days earlier. Andrew heard Patricia's voice before he saw her, a wail of anguish that came from the corridor, the sound a mother makes when facing her worst nightmare. They came into the room, and Patricia went straight to Melissa's bedside, her hands reaching for her daughter, then pulling back, afraid to touch, afraid of causing pain or dislodging some critical line or machine. "My baby," she sobbed. "Oh my God, my baby." Robert stood beside Andrew, his hand gripping Andrew's shoulder hard enough to hurt, and Andrew realized the older man was using him for support, literally leaning on him to stay upright. "What happened?" Robert asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The police told us there was an attack, that she was in surgery, but they couldn't give us details." Andrew told them the story for the second time that day, and it was no easier in the retelling. He told them about the hike, about deciding to continue despite the bear warning, about the tracks and the sighting and the chase and the attack. He told them about watching the bear bite Melissa, about the blood, about crawling to her and trying to stop the bleeding and calling for help. He told them everything except the part where he had wanted to turn back at the tracks, but had let Melissa convince him to continue, because that truth, that he could have prevented all of this, was too heavy to speak aloud. Patricia cried through his entire account, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. When Andrew finished, she turned to him, and for a moment he thought she was going to scream at him, to blame him, to say what he already knew, that this was his fault, that he should have protected her daughter, that he had failed in the most fundamental way possible. Instead, she hugged him. She pulled him up out of the wheelchair, ignoring his gasp of pain from his broken ribs, and held him tight, and cried against his shoulder. "You saved her," Patricia said, her words muffled against his hospital gown. "You kept her alive until help came. You saved her, Andrew." He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he hadn't saved anyone, that Melissa was lying half dead in an ICU bed because of decisions he had made or failed to make. But he said nothing, just held his mother-in-law and let her cry. Because what else could he do? They stayed at the hospital through the night, all three of them keeping vigil in Melissa's room. The nurses brought extra chairs, brought coffee and sandwiches that none of them ate, brought warm blankets when the room grew cold in the early morning hours. Dr. Morrison stopped by at 11:30 p.m. to check on Melissa's progress and to answer the Richardsons' questions, and she was patient and honest in a way that Andrew appreciated even as her honesty terrified him. "The next 72 hours are critical," Dr. Morrison told them, her voice quiet in the dim room. "If she can avoid infection, if her organs can recover from the shock, if there's no hidden internal bleeding, then her chances improve significantly. But right now we're taking it hour by hour. Hour by hour." That became the rhythm of their lives. Each hour, Rachel or one of the other ICU nurses would check Melissa's vitals, adjust medications, make notes in the chart. Each hour, someone would look at the monitors and the numbers and say whether things were stable or declining or improving. Each hour was a small victory if Melissa survived it, a countdown towards some undefined future where she might wake up and be herself again. Andrew dozed fitfully in his wheelchair, his body demanding rest despite his mind's refusal to quiet. Patricia sat in a chair pulled close to Melissa's bed, holding her daughter's hand and talking to her in a constant, soft murmur. Memories of Melissa's childhood, stories about family vacations and school plays and first days of kindergarten. Anything to fill the silence with love and life. Robert paced, moving between the window and the doorway and back again, unable to sit still, unable to do anything useful, but unable to leave. At 3:17 a.m., alarms began to sound on Melissa's monitors. Rachel rushed in, followed seconds later by two other nurses and a doctor Andrew hadn't seen before. They surrounded Melissa's bed, working with urgent efficiency, calling out numbers and instructions that Andrew didn't understand. Patricia was pushed back from the bedside, and she stood with her hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming, while the medical team worked. "Her blood pressure is dropping," Rachel called out. 60/30. She's tachycardic, heart rate 152. The doctor, young, probably a resident, was examining Melissa, pressing on her abdomen, listening to her chest. "Bleeding," he announced. "She's bleeding somewhere. Get Dr. Morrison down here now and prep an OR. We're going back in." They took Melissa back to surgery at 3:34 a.m., rushing her bed out of the ICU and down the corridor with Patricia running alongside, calling Melissa's name, begging her to hold on. Andrew couldn't follow. His wheelchair couldn't keep up with the running medical team, and a nurse gently but firmly told him he needed to stay in the ICU anyway. He, Patricia, and Robert were left in the empty room, with all its silent machines waiting for news that would either save them or destroy them. The surgery took 4 hours. "Doctor, Morrison found bleeding from a small artery that had been damaged during the bear attack, but hadn't manifested until hours later when Melissa's blood pressure started to recover. They cauterized the bleeder, did another debridement of damaged tissue, and closed Melissa back up. When Dr. Morrison came out to talk to them at 7:41 a.m., she looked exhausted, grey-faced with fatigue, but cautiously optimistic. "We got it," she said simply. "The bleeding is controlled. She's stable again. But I have to tell you, she can't survive many more crises like this. Her body is being pushed to its absolute limit." They brought Melissa back to the ICU at 8:03 a.m. on the morning of May 6th, which was officially 1 day after the attack, but felt like a lifetime later. The sun was rising outside the hospital windows, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink, and Andrew thought bitterly about how beautiful it was, how the world could be so casually magnificent while his wife fought for her life. News of the attack was spreading beyond the hospital. Parks Canada had issued a statement about the incident, and media outlets were beginning to pick up the story. Bear attack in Banff National Park. Newlywed seriously injured. The details were still vague. Parks Canada didn't release victims' names without permission, but reporters were calling the hospital, trying to get information, sensing the kind of story that would capture public attention. Andrew's phone, retrieved from his personal effects, was filling with missed calls and text messages. His parents, his brothers, friends from Calgary, who had heard rumors and were desperate for information. Melissa's friends, especially Jennifer Caldwell, her maid of honor, who had sent 15 texts ranging from "call me" to "please tell me it's not," true to simply "I love you both." Andrew couldn't deal with any of it, couldn't find the energy to call people back or respond to messages. Patricia took his phone, scrolled through the contacts, and began the heartbreaking work of informing people what had happened. "Is she going to wake up?" Andrew asked Rachel when she came in to do the 9 a.m. vitals check. It was the question that had been haunting him since the surgery. Would Melissa wake up? And if she did, would she still be Melissa? Rachel checked the monitors, made notes in the chart, before answering. "The sedation is keeping her unconscious right now," she explained. "She's on a propofol drip, which allows us to control her level of consciousness. The goal is to keep her comfortable and to let her body focus on healing without the stress and pain of being awake. When Dr. Morrison decides she's stable enough, they'll start to decrease the sedation and see if she wakes up on her own." "But there could be brain damage," Andrew said, making it a statement rather than a question, because he had heard Dr. Morrison mention it the night before. "From the blood loss, from shock." Rachel's face showed sympathy, but not false hope. "It's possible. The brain is very sensitive to oxygen deprivation, and your wife had significant blood loss before reaching the hospital. But she's young, and young brains are remarkably resilient. We won't know anything definitive until she wakes up. Try not to borrow trouble from the future, Mr. Grant. Focus on the fact that she's alive right now, in this moment. Alive right now, in this moment." That became Andrew's mantra, the thing he repeated to himself when fear threatened to overwhelm him. Melissa was alive. She was breathing, with mechanical help, but breathing. Her heart was beating. Her kidneys were producing urine, which meant they were functioning. Her liver was processing the medications flooding her system. All the small biological miracles that added up to life were still happening in her body, and as long as that remained true, there was hope. On May 7th, 48 hours after the attack, Dr. Morrison made the decision to begin lightening Melissa's sedation. "She's been stable for 24 hours, the surgeon explained during morning rounds, standing at the foot of Melissa's bed with her team of residents and nurses. "Her vitals are improving. There's no sign of infection so far, and her labs are trending in the right direction. I think it's time to see if she can wake up." They decreased the propofol drip gradually over the next 6 hours. Andrew sat beside Melissa's bed, holding her hand, watching for any sign of consciousness. Patricia and Robert had gone back to Calgary briefly to shower and change clothes, promising to return by evening, which meant Andrew was alone with his wife for the first time since the attack. He talked to her, told her about the hospital, about her parents, about all the people who were praying for her and thinking about her and waiting for her to wake up. He told her he loved her, told her repeatedly, told her in every way he could think to say it. And he waited. At 2:37 p.m., Melissa's fingers twitched in his hand. Andrew's heart leapt. "Melissa," he said, leaning close, "baby, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me." Nothing for a long moment, and then another twitch, more definite this time, almost certainly voluntary. Andrew lunged for the call button, pressed it urgently, and Rachel appeared within seconds. "She moved," Andrew said, his words tumbling out in excitement. "Her hand." She squeezed my hand. Rachel came to the bedside, checked the monitors, then leaned over Melissa. "Melissa, can you open your eyes for me?" She lifted one of Melissa's eyelids, shone a penlight into her pupil, checking for reaction. The pupil constricted, a good sign. Rachel did the same with the other eye, got the same response. Over the next hour, Melissa gradually surfaced from sedation. Her eyelids fluttered. Her breathing changed, becoming less synchronized with the ventilator, which was actually good. It meant she was trying to breathe on her own. At 3:15 p.m., her eyes opened. They were unfocused at first, staring at nothing, but then they moved, tracking across the ceiling to the machines, to Rachel, and finally to Andrew. Recognition flickered in her gaze, and Andrew saw her try to speak, her lips moving around the breathing tube. "Don't try to talk," Rachel instructed gently. "You have a tube in your throat helping you breathe. I know it's uncomfortable, but I need you to leave it alone. Can you nod if you understand me?" Melissa managed a tiny nod, and tears began to leak from the corners of her eyes. "You're in the hospital," Rachel continued, speaking slowly and clearly. "You were hurt, but you're safe now. Your husband is here with you. You're going to be okay." Andrew moved to where Melissa could see him more easily, his face close to hers. "I'm here," he told her, his own eyes filling with tears. "You're awake, Mel. You made it. You're going to be okay." Melissa's eyes moved from Andrew's face to the room beyond him, taking in the hospital equipment, the monitors, the white walls and fluorescent lights. Confusion showed clearly in her expression. Where am I? What happened? Why can't I breathe on my own? But behind the confusion was something else, something that broke Andrew's heart. Fear, raw, primal fear. Rachel performed a neurological assessment, asking Melissa to follow her finger with her eyes, to squeeze her hands, to wiggle her toes. Melissa responded to all the commands, which was incredibly good news. It suggested there was no major neurological damage, that her brain had survived the trauma intact. They would do more comprehensive testing later, but for now, the simple fact that she was conscious and responsive was enough. Dr. Morrison came in at 3:45 p.m., summoned by Rachel, and conducted her own examination. She was smiling, actually smiling, which Andrew had not seen her do before. "Melissa, I'm Dr. Morrison," she said, leaning into Melissa's line of sight. "I've been taking care of you since you came in. You're doing remarkably well. We're going to leave the breathing tube in for now, but if you continue to improve, we might be able to remove it tomorrow. For now, I want you to rest. Don't fight the ventilator. Let it do the work for you. Save your energy for healing. Okay?" Melissa's eyes had tracked to Andrew during this speech, and she stared at him with an intensity that seemed to be trying to communicate something. Her hand, the one he was holding, squeezed weakly, and her lips moved again around the tube. "What is it?" Andrew asked, leaning closer. "What are you trying to say?" Her lips formed a word silently. Andrew couldn't hear it, couldn't be certain, but he thought she said, "bear." He nodded, his throat tight. "The bear is gone," he told her, not sure if it was the truth, but needing to offer her some comfort. "It's gone, and it can't hurt you anymore. You're safe. I promise you're safe." Whether she believed him or not, he couldn't tell. Her eyes closed, exhausted by even this brief period of consciousness, and she slipped back into sleep. Natural sleep this time, not sedation, which was another positive sign. Andrew sat back in his chair, emotionally drained, and realized his hands were shaking. She had woken up. She was conscious, responsive, aware. It wasn't a guarantee of full recovery, but it was more than he had dared to hope for during the dark hours of the previous night. Patricia and Robert returned at 6 p.m. and wept with joy when Rachel told them Melissa had been awake. They had missed it, missed seeing their daughter conscious, and Patricia was clearly torn between happiness that Melissa had woken up and devastation that she hadn't been there to see it. But Rachel assured them that Melissa would likely wake again soon, that she was cycling in and out of sleep naturally now, and sure enough, at 6:47 p.m., Melissa's eyes opened again. This time she seemed more alert, more present. Her eyes found her mother immediately, and Patricia moved to the bedside, took Melissa's hand, and began crying all over again, telling her daughter how much she loved her, how brave she was, how proud Patricia was of her fighting spirit. The evening progressed with Melissa drifting in and out of consciousness, each waking period slightly longer than the last. By 9 p.m., she was staying awake for 10 to 15 minutes at a time, though she was clearly uncomfortable with the breathing tube and kept reaching toward it with weak, uncoordinated movements that Rachel had to gently redirect. Dr. Morrison came by at 10:30 p.m., her day clearly extending far beyond normal working hours, and made the decision to try removing the breathing tube. "She's breathing over the ventilator consistently now," the surgeon explained. "Her oxygen saturation is good. I think she can manage on her own. Melissa, we're going to take the tube out. It's going to be uncomfortable for a moment, but then you'll be able to breathe on your own and talk. I need you to take a deep breath and cough when I tell you to. Can you do that?" Melissa nodded, and Andrew saw determination in her eyes, mixed with fear. The extubation was brief but difficult to watch. Dr. Morrison deflated the balloon that held the tube in place, told Melissa to cough, and pulled the tube out in one smooth motion. Melissa did cough, a harsh, rattling sound, and then gasped, drawing in air on her own for the first time in 2 days. She coughed again, her face reddening with the effort, and Rachel was there immediately with a cup of ice chips, helping Melissa take tiny sips of water to soothe her raw throat. "Easy," Rachel coached. "Small breaths. Your throat is going to be sore for a while." Boo. When the coughing subsided, Melissa lay back against the pillows, breathing on her own, but with an oxygen cannula now in place under her nose to provide supplemental oxygen. Her eyes were watering from the coughing, but she looked at Andrew and spoke her first words since the attack. "Andrew." Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and painful sounding, but it was her voice. "What happened to me?" Andrew glanced at Dr. Morrison, unsure how much to say, how much Melissa was ready to hear. The surgeon nodded, giving permission, and Andrew took Melissa's hand again and told her as gently as he could. "We were hiking Corey Pass. A grizzly bear attacked us. It hurt you badly, Mel. You've been in surgery twice, but you're going to be okay. You're going to recover." Melissa's eyes widened, and Andrew saw memory flickering behind them, fragments of the attack perhaps, or just the knowledge that something terrible had happened being confirmed. "My back!" she whispered, and tried to reach behind herself, but Rachel caught her hand. "Don't touch," Rachel said gently. "You have a wound on your back that we're working hard to keep clean and healing. You can't disturb the dressings." "How bad?" Melissa asked, looking at her mother, then at Andrew, then at Dr. Morrison, searching for truth in their faces. Dr. Morrison pulled up a chair and sat down, giving Melissa the same direct honesty she had given Andrew. "It's serious," she said. "The bear bit you on your upper back, causing significant tissue damage. We've repaired what we could, but you're going to need multiple surgeries over the coming weeks as we work to close the wound properly. You'll have permanent scarring. You might have some loss of mobility in your shoulders depending on nerve damage. But you're alive, Melissa, and that's what matters. You survived something that kills most people." Melissa absorbed this in silence, tears running down her face, and then turned to Andrew. "Were you hurt?" "Some," Andrew admitted, touching his wrapped ribs gingerly. "Broken ribs, dislocated shoulder, punctured lung. But I'm okay. Nothing compared to what you went through." "You saved me," Melissa whispered. "No," Andrew said, shaking his head. "The paramedics saved you. The surgeons saved you. You saved yourself by being strong enough to survive." But Melissa was already drifting back to sleep, exhausted by even this brief conversation, and Andrew sat back, watching her breathe on her own, watching her chest rise and fall, watching her live, and he sent up a prayer of thanks to whatever forces in the universe had allowed her to survive. The next days fell into a pattern. Melissa would wake, stay conscious for increasing periods, then sleep again as her body devoted its energy to healing. Each day, Dr. Morrison and her team would unwrap the bandages on Melissa's back, inspect the wound, debride any tissue that wasn't healing properly, and rewrap everything in fresh dressings. Each time, Melissa would need pain medication so strong it made her loopy and disconnected. And each time she would cry afterward from the pain and the indignity and the knowledge of what had been done to her body. Andrew was discharged from the hospital on May 8th, 3 days after the attack, with instructions to rest, take his pain medication, and follow up with orthopedics for his shoulder and with pulmonology for his punctured lung. But he didn't leave. He moved from his room into Melissa's, sleeping in a reclining chair beside her bed, refusing to go home to Calgary, even when his parents drove up and begged him to come back with them for a few days of proper rest. "I'm not leaving her," Andrew told them firmly, "not until she can come with me." Patricia and Robert had taken a room at a hotel in Banff, the Coast Mountain Lodge, and were at the hospital every day from early morning until late night. Patricia brought things from home: Melissa's favorite pillow, her own pajamas to replace the hospital gown, photos from the wedding to pin on the bulletin board in the room. Robert brought food from local restaurants, trying to tempt Melissa to eat when she showed little interest in the hospital meals. The psychological toll of the attack was becoming evident as Melissa spent more time awake. She had nightmares, violent, screaming nightmares that had her thrashing in bed despite her injuries, trying to get away from a bear that existed only in her traumatized mind. She startled at sudden noises, at the door opening, at people approaching her bed from behind where she couldn't see them. She cried frequently, sometimes about the pain, sometimes about the attack, sometimes about nothing at all, just crying because her emotions were too big and too raw to contain. A psychiatrist, Dr. Elena Vasquez, began visiting daily. She specialized in trauma and PTSD, and she explained to Melissa and her family that what Melissa was experiencing was normal, horrible but normal, in the aftermath of a life-threatening attack. "Your mind is trying to process something it was never designed to process," Dr. Vasquez said during one of her sessions with Melissa. "Bears are prehistoric predators. Your brain is reacting to a threat that triggers the deepest, most ancient parts of our survival instinct. It's going to take time and therapy and patience to work through this." "Will I ever feel safe again?" Melissa asked, her voice small and lost. "Yes," Dr. Vasquez said with certainty. "Not today, not next week, probably not even next month, but yes, eventually you will feel safe again. You'll learn to manage the fear, to put it in perspective, to reclaim your life from the attack. But it requires work, Melissa. It requires you to engage with therapy, to talk about what happened, to process the trauma instead of burying it." On May 11th, 6 days after the attack, Melissa was stable enough to be told the full extent of what had happened while she was unconscious. Dr. Morrison brought in a tablet and showed Melissa images of the wound site, carefully explaining what had been done during the surgeries and what still needed to be done. The wound on Melissa's back was, in medical terms, a full-thickness soft tissue defect, a cavity roughly 15 centimeters by 12 centimeters, where muscle and fat had been torn away. It would eventually require a skin graft, Dr. Morrison explained. Once the wound bed was healthy enough to accept the graft, the process would take weeks, possibly months. Melissa looked at the images in silence, her face pale, and then asked the question that had been haunting her. "Will I be able to work again? As a nurse?" Dr. Morrison considered this carefully before answering. "I don't see any reason why not, eventually. Your arms and hands weren't affected. The damage is to your back, which will limit some range of motion and will make prolonged standing or lifting difficult. But pediatric nursing isn't as physically demanding as some other specialties. With physical therapy and time, I think you'll be able to return to work. But Melissa, we're talking about months of recovery, not weeks. You need to adjust your expectations accordingly." Melissa nodded, but Andrew could see the devastation in her eyes. Her job was her identity, her purpose, and the thought of being unable to do it was almost as traumatic as the attack itself. The media attention was intensifying. The Calgary Herald had run a front-page story, "Honeymoon Horror, Newlywed Mauled by Grizzly in Banff National Park." Other outlets picked it up, CBC News, CTV, Global News. Parks Canada was under pressure to explain why the trail had been open despite known bear activity, why warning signs weren't more prominent, why hikers had been allowed to proceed despite the sighting of a sow with cubs days earlier. Wildlife advocates were calling for the bear to be relocated rather than destroyed. Hunting groups were calling for the bear to be tracked and killed immediately. On May 12th, Parks Canada held a press conference. The agency's chief park warden, Thomas Mackenzie, a weathered man in his 60s who had spent his entire career managing wildlife in the Canadian Rockies, faced a room full of reporters and cameras and explained what had happened. On May 5th, at approximately 3:15 p.m., 2 hikers were attacked by a grizzly bear on the western descent of the Corey Pass Trail in Banff National Park. Both hikers sustained injuries. One was critically injured and remains hospitalized. Our wildlife team has been investigating the incident and tracking the bear responsible. We've identified the bear as an adult female grizzly, approximately 7 to 9 years old, with 2 cubs of the year. Based on the investigation, we believe the attack was defensive in nature. The hikers surprised the sow, likely came between her and her cubs, and she reacted to protect her offspring. A reporter shouted a question. "Will the bear be destroyed?" Mackenzie took a breath before answering. "That decision has not been made yet. We're consulting with wildlife biologists, reviewing the circumstances of the attack and considering all options. Grizzly bears are a protected species in Canada, and our default position is always to preserve wildlife when possible. However, public safety is our primary concern. A bear that has attacked humans poses a potential ongoing threat, and we take that very seriously." Another reporter. "Were the hikers at fault? Did they do something to provoke the bear?" "I want to be very clear," Mackenzie said, his voice hardening. "The hikers did nothing wrong. They were hiking during daylight hours on a marked trail. They were carrying bear spray and using it properly. They were making noise to alert wildlife to their presence. This was simply a tragic encounter in wild country where bears live. Sometimes, despite all precautions, these things happen. It's the risk inherent in recreating in bear habitat." The press conference continued for 30 minutes, with Mackenzie fielding questions about bear populations, trail closures, future warning systems, and Parks Canada's liability. But the key points were already established. The bear was a mother protecting cubs, the attack was defensive, and the decision on the bear's fate was still pending. In Melissa's hospital room, watching the press conference on the small television mounted to the wall, the family absorbed this information in silence. Finally, Patricia spoke. "They're going to kill that bear." "Maybe not," Robert said, though he didn't sound convinced. "If it was defending its cubs—" "They're going to kill it," Patricia repeated, and she wasn't wrong. On May 15th, 10 days after the attack, Parks Canada announced that the decision had been made. The grizzly bear responsible for the attack had been located, darted with a tranquilizer, and euthanized. DNA testing of saliva recovered from Melissa's clothing had confirmed it was the same animal. The 2 cubs, now motherless, had been captured and would be relocated to a wildlife rehabilitation facility where they would be cared for and, if possible, eventually released back into the wild in a remote area far from human activity. Andrew felt conflicted about the bear's death. On one hand, it was the animal that had nearly killed his wife. that had destroyed their honeymoon and forever altered their lives. On the other hand, the bear had been doing what bears do, protecting its cubs. It hadn't been a rogue animal, hadn't been hunting humans for sport. It had reacted to a perceived threat. And now it was dead, its cubs orphaned, because it had crossed paths with two humans in the wrong place at the wrong time. Melissa's reaction was stronger. When she heard the news, she cried for an hour, great heaving sobs that had the nurses worried about her reopening her wounds. "It's not fair," she kept saying. "It's not fair. It was just protecting its babies. It didn't deserve to die." "It attacked you," Andrew pointed out gently. "It almost killed you." "I know," Melissa said, her voice thick with tears. "I know it did. And I'm terrified of bears now, Andrew. I have nightmares about them every night. But it wasn't the bear's fault, it was ours. We went into its home, we surprised it, we made it feel threatened, and now it's dead because of us." The guilt that Andrew had been carrying since the attack intensified. Not only had his decisions led to Melissa being mauled, but they had also led to a bear being killed, to cubs being orphaned. The ripples from that moment when he had agreed to continue hiking despite his better judgment seemed to expand infinitely outward, causing harm in directions he hadn't even considered. Melissa was transferred out of the ICU on May 17th, 12 days after the attack. She moved to a regular room in the surgical ward, a sign that her condition had improved enough that she no longer needed intensive monitoring. It felt like a milestone, like progress, even though Melissa herself didn't feel much better. Her back still hurt constantly, a deep, grinding pain that medication could dull but not eliminate. She couldn't lie on her back, couldn't roll over without help, couldn't shower or use the bathroom without assistance. Her independence had been stripped away, and she hated every moment of it. Physical therapy began on May 18th. A cheerful woman named Amanda, who specialized in post-trauma rehabilitation, came to Melissa's room and assessed her range of motion, her strength, her pain levels. The prognosis was cautiously optimistic. Melissa's limbs all worked, her spine had not been damaged, her muscles would eventually regain their strength. But it would be a long process, Amanda warned. Weeks of therapy, months of gradual improvement, possibly years before Melissa felt completely normal again. "And I need to prepare you," Amanda said during that first session, "for the possibility that you might never feel completely normal again. There's likely to be permanent scarring, permanent limitation in your range of motion. You might have chronic pain. These are realities we need to face and plan for." Melissa nodded numbly, because what else could she do? Her future, which had seemed so bright and full of promise on the morning of May 5th, had been rewritten entirely. She was no longer a young woman starting married life with infinite possibilities ahead of her. She was a trauma survivor, a victim, someone who would spend the rest of her life explaining scars and flinching at sudden movements and wondering if she would ever feel whole again. The wedding photos arrived at the hospital on May 20th. Jennifer Caldwell, Melissa's best friend and maid of honor, brought them in person, having made the drive from Calgary specifically to see Melissa. Jennifer cried when she saw Melissa in the hospital bed, cried at the tubes and monitors and bandages, at how small and fragile her friend looked. But she pulled herself together quickly, the way Jennifer always did, and sat beside Melissa's bed to flip through the photos together. The wedding had been beautiful. The photos showed Melissa in her white dress, radiant and smiling, Andrew in his tuxedo looking nervous and happy, their families and friends gathered in celebration. There was a photo of Melissa and Andrew's first dance, another of them cutting the cake, another of them surrounded by bridesmaids and groomsmen on the church steps in a shower of rice and confetti. "That was 15 days ago," Melissa said, staring at a photo of herself laughing at something Andrew had whispered during the reception. 15 days. That person in the photo feels like a stranger. Like someone I used to know but can't remember being. You're still you, Jennifer said firmly, taking Melissa's hand. You're hurt, and you're scared, and you're going through hell, but you're still Melissa. You're still my best friend who can't carry a tune, but sings anyway. You're still the woman who decided to be a pediatric nurse because you can't stand seeing kids suffer. You're still the person who laughs so hard at stupid jokes that you snort. The bear didn't take that away from you. It can't take that away from you. Melissa wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that she was still herself, that the attack hadn't fundamentally changed who she was. But when she looked at the wedding photos, at that happy, whole, undamaged woman in the white dress, all she could feel was grief for what had been lost. On May 22nd, 17 days after the attack, Melissa underwent her third surgery. The wound on her back had healed enough that Dr. Morrison felt comfortable attempting a skin graft. They would take healthy skin from Melissa's thigh and transplant it to her back, helping to close the wound and speed healing. The surgery was expected to take 4 hours. Andrew paced the surgical waiting room while Melissa was in the OR, wearing a path in the carpet, unable to sit still. Patricia and Robert sat together on a couch, holding hands, praying quietly. Time moved with agonizing slowness. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like days. At 2:37 p.m., Dr. Morrison emerged from the surgical suite still wearing her scrubs, her face tired but satisfied. "The graft went well," she told them. "We were able to cover about 60% of the wound area. The rest will need to heal by secondary intention, gradually closing on its own, or possibly require another graft in a few weeks. But this is significant progress. If the graft takes, if her body accepts it and it integrates well, we've just shortened her recovery time considerably." "Can we see her?" Patricia asked. "She's in recovery right now. Give her an hour to wake up, and then yes." That hour was another eternity of waiting, but finally they were allowed back to see Melissa. She was groggy from anesthesia, her eyes half closed, but she managed a weak smile when she saw them. "Did it work?" she asked, her words slightly slurred. "It worked," Andrew told her, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Dr. Morrison says it went really well." "Good," Melissa murmured, and then, incongruously, "My leg hurts." "Why does my leg hurt?" "They took skin from your thigh for the graft," Andrew explained gently. "So now you have 2 wounds healing instead of 1. "Great," Melissa said, and despite the pain medication, her sense of humor flickered through. "I wasn't damaged enough already, had to add more damage." Andrew laughed, surprised and delighted to hear her make a joke, even a dark one. It was the first glimpse he'd had since the attack of the Melissa he had fallen in love with, the woman who could find humor even in terrible situations, who refused to be beaten down by life's hardships. The recovery from the third surgery was difficult. Both the donor site on Melissa's thigh and the graft site on her back had to be kept clean and monitored for infection. Melissa had to remain mostly immobile for several days to allow the graft to integrate, which meant more time in bed, more dependence on nurses for basic care, more frustration at her body's limitations. But slowly, incrementally, she was healing. The wound on her back began to close. Her strength gradually returned. She could sit up without assistance, then stand with a walker, then take halting steps around the room. Each small victory was celebrated. The first time she walked to the bathroom on her own, the first time she ate a full meal, the first time she went an entire night without nightmares. On June 2nd, 28 days after the attack, Melissa was discharged from the hospital. She left in a wheelchair, 2 weeks still to walk long distances, with Andrew pushing her and her parents walking alongside. The media was waiting outside. Reporters and cameras that had been tipped off about the discharge, and hospital security had to create a path through the crowd. "Melissa, how are you feeling? Do you blame Parks Canada for the attack?" Are you going to sue? Will you ever go hiking again? Andrew wanted to scream at them, to tell them to leave his wife alone, that she didn't owe them anything, but hospital security was already moving them toward the waiting vehicle, Robert's truck, with Patricia riding in the back seat to help Melissa. They loaded Melissa carefully, everyone terrified of hurting her or disturbing her wounds, and then Andrew climbed into the passenger seat and Robert drove them away from Banff, away from the hospital, away from the mountains that had almost killed them. The drive back to Calgary took an hour and 40 minutes. Melissa dozed most of the way, exhausted from the simple effort of getting dressed and moving from the hospital room to the truck. Andrew watched the landscape pass outside the window, the same views he had seen on the drive to the trailhead on May 5th, but now they looked different, tainted by memory and trauma. They passed the turnoff for the Bow Valley Parkway, and Andrew felt his chest tighten, remembering how excited they had been, how confident, how completely unaware of what was about to happen. They had decided that Melissa would stay with her parents during the initial recovery period, rather than going to the apartment she and Andrew shared in downtown Calgary. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building with no elevator, which made it inaccessible for someone in Melissa's condition. The Richardsons' house in Edgemont was single-story, spacious, and Patricia had already prepared a room for Melissa with a hospital bed rented from a medical supply company, a commode for nighttime use, and all the supplies needed for wound care. Settling Melissa into the house was a production that took an hour. Getting her out of the truck, helping her into the house, transferring her to the bed, making sure she was comfortable and had everything she needed within reach. Patricia bustled around, asking questions, fussing over pillows and blankets, until finally Melissa said, "Mom, I love you, but I just need to sleep. Please." Patricia looked hurt but backed off, and she and Robert retreated to the living room, leaving Andrew alone with Melissa in the quiet bedroom. He pulled a chair close to her bed and took her hand, the gesture so familiar now that it was automatic. "We made it," he said softly. "We're home." "This isn't home," Melissa replied, her eyes closed. "Home is our apartment. Home is our life that we were supposed to be starting. This is... I don't know what this is." Andrew didn't have an answer for that. He squeezed her hand and sat with her until she fell asleep, and then he went to find his in-laws and begin the process of figuring out how they were going to navigate this new reality. The following weeks were a blur of home nursing visits, physical therapy appointments, wound care, medications, and slow, frustrating progress. A visiting nurse came daily to check Melissa's wounds, change dressings, monitor for infection. The graft had taken well, but the surrounding tissue was still healing, still angry and red and painful. Physical therapy sessions happened 3 times a week, with Amanda coming to the house to put Melissa through exercises designed to restore range of motion and rebuild strength. Each session left Melissa exhausted and crying from pain and frustration. Andrew tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. He went to the house every day, spending hours with Melissa, helping where he could, trying to be supportive without being overbearing. But their relationship had changed. They were no longer newlyweds enjoying the early days of marriage. They were a trauma survivor and her caretaker, navigating injury and recovery and the 1,000 small indignities that came with Melissa's dependence. They hadn't been intimate since the wedding night, and both of them understood without discussing it that intimacy was far off in the future, if it ever returned at all. Melissa's body was broken, painful, and she couldn't bear to be touched in ways that reminded her she was a sexual being. Andrew's body was still healing too, his ribs tender, his shoulder stiff and weak. But more than the physical barriers, there was an emotional distance that had grown between them, a space filled with trauma and fear and unspoken grief for what had been taken from them. Dr. Vasquez, the psychiatrist, began seeing Melissa twice a week. The sessions were in person at first, with Andrew driving Melissa to Dr. Vasquez's office in downtown Calgary, but when that proved too exhausting, they switched to video calls. The therapy focused on PTSD, processing the attack, managing the nightmares and flashbacks, developing coping strategies for the anxiety that had become Melissa's constant companion. "You're showing classic signs of post-traumatic stress disorder," Dr. Vasquez explained during one session that Andrew was invited to attend. "Hypervigilance, avoidance behaviors, intrusive thoughts about the attack, difficulty sleeping, irritability. These are normal responses to abnormal trauma. The goal of therapy is not to make you forget what happened. That's not possible or even desirable. The goal is to integrate the trauma into your life story in a way that doesn't dominate your existence." "I don't think I'll ever not be afraid of bears," Melissa said quietly. "You don't have to not be afraid, Doctor." Vasquez replied, "Fear is reasonable. A bear almost killed you. Being afraid of bears is a logical, adaptive response. The problem is when that fear spreads to other areas of your life, when it keeps you from doing things you want to do, when it controls your decisions and robs you of joy. That's what we're working to prevent." The investigation into the attack continued through June. Parks Canada's Wildlife Attack Review Team conducted extensive interviews with Andrew, with the paramedics who had responded, with other hikers who had been on the trail that day. They examined the attack site, measured distances, documented evidence. They were building a comprehensive report that would determine whether Parks Canada had any liability, whether warning procedures needed to be changed, whether the trail should be permanently closed. On June 18th, an investigator named James Donnelly came to the Richardson house to interview Melissa. He was a large man in his 50s, with a gentle manner, conscious of Melissa's fragility. He asked her to recount the day from the beginning, waking up at the hotel, the drive to the trailhead, the hike itself, the attack. Melissa told the story haltingly, stopping frequently to compose herself when memories threatened to overwhelm her. "When you saw the tracks," Donnelly asked, "the grisly tracks at the 3.4-kilometer mark, did you consider turning back?" "Yes," Melissa said. "We discussed it. But we thought the bear was probably long gone. Other hikers had continued past the tracks and hadn't seen anything. We were making noise. We had bear spray. We thought we were being safe." Donnelly made notes. "And when you actually saw the bear before the attack, what was your reaction?" "Terror," Melissa said simply. "Complete, absolute terror. It was huge, Mr. Donnelly, bigger than anything I had imagined, and the way it moved, so fast. We thought if we ran, we could get away. We thought—" "Oh," she trailed off, realizing how foolish it sounded in retrospect. "Running was the wrong decision," Donnelly said, but his tone wasn't judgmental, just factual. "But in the moment, with adrenaline flooding your system, rational decision-making goes out the window. Most people would have done the same thing. You can't blame yourself for reacting like a human being." But Melissa did blame herself, Andrew knew. She blamed herself for suggesting the Corey Pass Trail in the first place, for insisting they continue despite the warnings, for running when she should have stood her ground. The guilt was eating at her, compounding the trauma, making recovery even more difficult. July brought more progress. Melissa was walking with a cane now, no longer needing the walker. She could dress herself, shower with minimal assistance, move around the house with increasing confidence. The wound on her back was closed completely, though the scar was extensive, a twisted landscape of raised tissue that would mark her forever. She began physical therapy at an outpatient clinic rather than at home, which felt like another step toward normalcy. But psychologically, Melissa was struggling. The nightmares hadn't decreased. If anything, they were getting worse. She would wake screaming several times a week, thrashing and fighting an invisible attacker. She couldn't stand having people approach her from behind. She had panic attacks triggered by unexpected noises or by seeing large dogs that reminded her of the bear. Her world had contracted to the boundaries of her parents' house and the short list of places she felt safe enough to visit. The physical therapy clinic, Dr. Vasquez's office, occasionally the grocery store when she could work up the nerve. Andrew was struggling too, though he tried to hide it from Melissa. His physical injuries had healed, the ribs had mended, the shoulder had regained most of its range of motion, the punctured lung had reinflated and was functioning normally. But he was having his own nightmares, his own intrusive thoughts about the attack. He saw the bear in his dreams, saw Melissa being torn apart, saw his own helplessness replayed in endless variations. He felt guilty for being less injured than Melissa, guilty for the decisions that had led to the attack, guilty for surviving when the bear could just as easily have killed him. He went back to work at Suncor Energy in mid-July, 2 months and 1 week after the attack. His boss and colleagues were understanding, giving him a light workload to ease back into routine. But Andrew found it difficult to focus, difficult to care about software bugs and system optimizations when his wife was at home fighting to reclaim her life. He would sit at his desk, staring at code on his screen, and suddenly be back on the mountain, hearing Melissa scream, watching her fall. His company offered counseling services, and Andrew finally agreed to see a therapist, Dr. Marcus Reed, who specialized in trauma and survivor's guilt. The sessions helped, though not in the way Andrew had expected. Dr. Reed didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. Instead, he helped Andrew understand that what he was feeling was normal, that trauma didn't respect logic or fairness, that healing would be a long, non-linear process. "You're experiencing something called moral injury," Dr. Reed explained during one session. "You believe you failed to protect your wife, that you made decisions that led to her being harmed. That belief is causing you psychological damage separate from the trauma of witnessing the attack itself. And here's the difficult part. I can't tell you that you didn't make mistakes because I wasn't there, and analyzing your decisions with hindsight is meaningless. What I can tell you is that you made the best decisions you could with the information you had at the time, and that you acted courageously during and after the attack. You probably saved your wife's life by calling for help and keeping her alive until the paramedics arrived." "It doesn't feel like enough," Andrew said quietly. "It never feels like enough for people with moral injury. But Andrew, at some point, you're going to have to forgive yourself. Not today, probably not next month, but eventually. Because you can't carry this guilt for the rest of your life. It will destroy you and your marriage if you let it." On August 1st, 3 months after the attack, Parks Canada released its official report on the incident. The report was comprehensive, running to 47 pages, with detailed analysis of the events leading up to the attack itself, and recommendations for future prevention. The conclusions were, in some ways, simultaneously absolving and damning. The report found that the Grants had acted reasonably and responsibly throughout their hike. Warning signage about bear activity was present and accurate. The trail should not have been closed, based on the bear sighting 3 days prior, as that fell within normal parameters for bear activity in the park. The attack was defensive in nature, with the sow reacting to protect her cubs. No single factor was responsible for the attack, but rather a confluence of circumstances: wrong place, wrong time, wrong wind direction that prevented the bear from scenting the hikers earlier. Parks Canada procedures were adequate and did not need major revision, though recommendations included more prominent signage and possibly requiring groups of 4 or more on certain high-risk trails. The media coverage of the report was extensive. News outlets dissected the findings, interviewed bear experts, debated whether Parks Canada should have done more. Some activists called for trails in grizzly habitat to be closed entirely. Outdoor recreation groups argued that closing trails would be an overreaction that punished millions of responsible hikers for one tragic incident. Andrew and Melissa, still mostly confined to the Richardson house, watched the coverage with a sense of unreality. Their trauma had become public property, endlessly analyzed and debated by people who had never stood face to face with a charging grizzly, who had never watched someone they loved being mauled, who treated the attack as an interesting intellectual exercise rather than a life-destroying catastrophe. On August 15th, Melissa returned to the wedding venue where she and Andrew had celebrated just over 3 months earlier, not for a happy occasion, but for trauma therapy. Dr. Vasquez had suggested exposure therapy, gradually confronting triggers and places associated with the trauma to reduce their power over Melissa's emotional state. The wedding venue wasn't directly related to the attack, but it was associated with the honeymoon trip, and Dr. Vasquez thought it might be a useful intermediary step before eventually confronting bigger triggers. They walked through the empty reception hall where they had danced and celebrated. Melissa cried, overwhelmed by memories of how happy she had been that night, how certain of the future, how completely unprepared for what was coming. Andrew held her while she cried, his own eyes wet, mourning not just for what the bear had taken from them, but for the innocence they had possessed on their wedding day, the belief that life was fundamentally fair, that being careful and responsible would keep them safe, that love was enough. September brought a new challenge, the decision of whether Melissa would return to work. Alberta Children's Hospital had been holding her position, keeping her on paid medical leave, waiting for her to heal sufficiently to come back. Dr. Morrison had cleared her for light duty with restrictions, no lifting over 20 pounds, no shifts longer than 8 hours, frequent breaks to rest her back. But Melissa wasn't sure she could do it. Wasn't sure she could return to the high-stress environment of pediatric oncology when her own trauma was still so raw. What if I have a panic attack in front of patients? Melissa asked Andrew one evening as they sat on the back patio of her parents' house, watching the sun set over the western horizon. What if I freeze up, or start crying, or can't handle the pressure? Then you handle it, Andrew said. You talk to your supervisor, you take a break, you work through it. Mel, you've been working with dying children for 5 years. If you can handle that, you can handle this. I'm not the same person I was, Melissa said, and it wasn't the first time she had said it. That nurse who walked into the hospital in April is gone. I don't know who I am now. You're my wife, Andrew said. You're a survivor. You're someone who's been through hell and is still here. That's not nothing, Mel. She decided to try. On September 15th, 4 months and 10 days after the attack, Melissa walked back into Alberta Children's Hospital for the first time since the honeymoon. She was terrified, shaking as she entered the building, but she did it. She met with her supervisor, toured the unit, talked to colleagues who hugged her and cried, and told her how much they had missed her. She started back part-time the following week. 4-hour shifts, 3 days a week. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. Her back ached from being on her feet, her anxiety was constant, and she struggled to focus on patient care when her own mental health was so fragile. But she kept showing up, kept trying, kept taking small steps forward, even when every instinct screamed at her to retreat back into the safety of her parents' house. Andrew and Melissa moved back into their own apartment in October. Patricia cried when they left, worried about Melissa's ability to manage on her own, but both Andrew and Melissa knew it was time. They needed to rebuild their marriage, to remember how to be a couple rather than a patient and a caretaker. The apartment felt different now, smaller, less like a home, and more like a hotel room they were staying in temporarily. But it was theirs, and they were together, and they were alive. They started couples counseling in November. Dr. Vasquez had recommended it. noting that trauma could drive wedges between even the strongest couples, creating resentment and distance that could become permanent if not addressed. The counselor, Dr. Amira Hassan, specialized in relationships impacted by trauma, and she helped them navigate the difficult terrain of their changed marriage. "You're both grieving," Dr. Hassan explained during one session. "You're grieving the life you thought you would have, the people you were before the attack, the innocence you lost. And you're grieving together, but also separately, because your experiences of the trauma, while related, were different. Andrew, you witnessed Melissa being attacked, which is its own particular horror. Melissa, you experience the physical trauma and carry the scars. Those are different griefs, and they're valid, and they need to be honored." The sessions were hard, forcing them to confront things they had been avoiding. Andrew's guilt, Melissa's resentment that Andrew had been less injured, the intimacy they had lost, the future that felt uncertain. But slowly, incrementally, they began to rebuild. Not the marriage they had before, but something new, something forged by survival. On May 3rd, 2026, their first wedding anniversary, Andrew and Melissa drove to Kananaskis country, to the same spot where Andrew had proposed. They didn't hike. Melissa wasn't ready for that, might never be ready for that. But they sat by the lake, held hands, and watched the mountains they both loved and feared. "We survived," Melissa said, and Andrew nodded, squeezing her hand. It wasn't the anniversary they had imagined a year ago, and they were not the same people who had gotten married in St. Mary's Cathedral with such hope and joy. But they were here, together, alive and in its own way. That was enough. Not perfect, not unmarked by trauma, but enough. The bear that had attacked them was gone, killed by Parks Canada wildlife officers. Its cubs had been released into the wild in northern British Columbia, fitted with tracking collars, monitored for their ability to survive without their mother. Early reports suggested they were thriving, hunting and foraging successfully, learning to be wild bears in a wild place. Melissa thought about those cubs sometimes, wondered if they remembered their mother, if they dreamed about the day strange creatures had stumbled into their territory and changed everything. She hoped they would have long lives, that they would never again encounter humans, that they would die old and satisfied, far from trails and warning signs and people like her who ventured into places they didn't belong. The legal proceedings that Patricia had asked about, the potential lawsuit against Parks Canada, never materialized. Andrew and Melissa decided not to sue, feeling that litigation would only extend the trauma, keep them tied to the worst day of their lives, rather than letting them move forward. Parks Canada offered a settlement anyway, a significant sum that covered Melissa's medical bills and lost wages, and represented acknowledgement of the suffering they had endured. They accepted it and used part of it to fund a scholarship at the University of Calgary for students studying wildlife biology and conservation, turning their trauma into something that might, in some small way, benefit the understanding and preservation of grizzly bears. In July 2026, Melissa returned to full-time work at Alberta Children's Hospital. She was a different nurse now, slower, more careful, more aware of her limitations. But she was also more empathetic to suffering, more conscious of how quickly life could change, more determined to bring comfort to children and families facing their own catastrophes. Her scars were visible when she changed clothes in the locker room, and she no longer tried to hide them. They were part of her story now, part of who she had become. Andrew continued with therapy, working through his guilt and PTSD with Dr. Reed's patient guidance. He never fully forgave himself for the decisions that led to the attack. That burden was one he carried and would always carry. But he learned to live with it, to accept that he was human and fallible, and that beating himself up endlessly served no purpose. He learned, slowly and painfully, to be kind to himself the way he was kind to others. In December 2026, 19 months after the attack, Melissa announced she was pregnant. The news was both joyful and terrifying. Pregnancy would put stress on her damaged back, and there were concerns about whether she could safely carry to term. But her doctors were cautiously optimistic, and Melissa was determined. Life had tried to destroy her on that mountain in Banff, and she was determined to create new life in defiance of death. Their daughter, Emma Patricia Grant, was born on August 12, 2027, weighing 7 pounds, 3 ounces, healthy and perfect. Andrew held her in the delivery room and cried, overwhelmed by the miracle of her existence, by the fact that life had somehow continued despite everything. Melissa, exhausted and in pain but radiant, looked at her daughter and felt, for the first time since May 5, 2025, something approaching wholeness. They would tell Emma about the attack someday, when she was old enough to understand. They would show her the scars on her mother's back, explain about grizzly bears and mountains, and the risks inherent in being alive. They would teach her to respect the wilderness, to understand that humans were visitors in wild places, that caution and preparation were necessary but never guaranteed safety. But for now, in the hospital room with their newborn daughter sleeping between them, Andrew and Melissa didn't think about the past or worry about the future. They existed in the present moment, in the simple joy of being together, of being alive, of having survived and continued and created something new out of trauma and loss. The mountains were still there, visible through the hospital window if they chose to look, the same peaks that had witnessed their near destruction. But they were just mountains now, rock and ice and stone, indifferent and eternal. The Grants had been changed by those mountains in ways that would never fully heal. But they had not been destroyed. They had survived, and they had endured, and that, in the end, was the truest victory over the grizzly bear that had tried to take everything from them on a sunny May afternoon in Banff National Park. The next stories. The Kodiak Nightmare. The morning mist hung thick over Whale Bay as Aaron Mitchell secured the final rope on their 17-foot aluminum fishing boat. His younger brother, Scott, stood at the stern, methodically checking their emergency equipment for the third time that morning. The two men had been planning this trip to the remote waters around Kodiak Island for over a year, ever since Aaron's divorce had finally been finalized, and Scott had taken his accumulated vacation time from the oil company where he worked as a safety inspector. "You're being paranoid again," Aaron called out, watching his brother inventory the flare gun, emergency radio, and life jackets. At 45, Aaron had the weathered look of someone who'd spent most of his adult life outdoors, first as a park ranger in Denali and later as a wilderness guide. His graying beard was neatly trimmed, and his green eyes held the kind of calm confidence that came from years of experience in Alaska's unforgiving wilderness. Scott Mitchell, 3 years younger but already showing more gray in his dark hair, looked up from the emergency kit with a slight frown. "Remember what happened to those guys from Anchorage last season? Found their boat drifting empty near Afognak Island. They never found the bodies." Scott's methodical nature had served him well in his career, where a missed safety check could mean the difference between life and death on an oil rig. The brothers had grown up in Kodiak, the sons of a commercial fisherman who taught them to respect the sea and the massive brown bears that ruled the islands. Their father, now deceased, had always told them that the moment you stopped being careful was the moment Alaska would remind you who was really in charge. "That's exactly why we're taking precautions," Aaron replied, patting the bear spray canister on his belt. "Besides, we're staying close to shore, and we've got the satellite communicator." He gestured to the yellow device mounted near the boat's controls. Mom would never forgive us if we took unnecessary risks. Their mother, Sarah Mitchell, had made them promise to check in every 4 hours. At 73, she'd already buried her husband and wasn't about to lose her sons to the same waters that had claimed so many over the years. She stood on the dock now, wrapped in a heavy wool coat against the October chill, watching her boys with the mixture of pride and worry that had defined her relationship with them since they were children. "You boys be smart out there," she called, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd raised 2 sons in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. "The salmon are running thick this year, which means the bears are going to be more active than usual." The Kodiak archipelago was home to the largest subspecies of brown bear in the world. These massive creatures, some weighing over 1,500 pounds, had evolved in isolation for thousands of years, developing into apex predators with no natural enemies except each other. October was a critical time for them as they prepared for winter, consuming up to 20,000 calories per day to build the fat reserves they'd need to survive hibernation. Aaron started the boat's 40-horsepower outboard motor, the sound echoing off the harbor's wooden pilings. The engine had been completely rebuilt the previous spring, and he'd spent hours testing it in preparation for this trip. Scott cast off the mooring lines and settled into the passenger seat, pulling his knit cap down over his ears as they navigated through the harbor's calm waters. The weather forecast had called for partly cloudy skies, with winds of 10 to 15 knots from the southwest, perfect conditions for their planned route along the island's western shore. They intended to fish the protected waters of Whale Bay and Karluk Lagoon, areas known for their abundant silver salmon and relative shelter from the open ocean swells. As they cleared the harbor breakwater, Aaron opened the throttle, and the boat rose onto plane, cutting through the small waves with satisfying efficiency. The coastline of Kodiak Island stretched before them, a dramatic landscape of steep bluffs, hidden coves, and dense forests of Sitka spruce. This was country that had changed little since the Russian fur traders first arrived in the 1700s, a place where nature still held absolute dominion. Scott pulled out his phone and took a photo of the receding harbor, intending to send it to his ex-wife Jennifer once they returned to cell coverage. Their divorce had been amicable, driven more by geography than animosity. She'd wanted to move back to the lower 48 for their daughter's college years, while Scott couldn't imagine living anywhere but Alaska. Their 16-year-old daughter, Emma, was now a sophomore at the University of Oregon, studying marine biology and planning to return to Alaska after graduation. "Remember when Dad brought us out here for the first time?" Scott shouted over the engine noise, gesturing toward a familiar point of land. "I must have been 8 or 9. Aaron nodded, his memory filling with images of their father's weathered hands, showing them how to tie proper fishing knots, how to read the water for signs of fish, and most importantly, how to watch for bears. Thomas Mitchell had been a third-generation Kodiak fisherman, a man who'd survived more close calls with weather and wildlife than most people could imagine. "You were 9, Aaron replied. "And you caught that king salmon that was almost as big as you were. Dad was so proud he took a picture with every camera on the boat." The memory brought a smile to both men's faces. Their father had been a quiet man, more comfortable showing his love through shared experiences than words. These fishing trips had been their classroom, where they'd learned not just how to fish, but how to be men in a place that demanded respect and humility. 40 minutes after leaving the harbor, they rounded a headland and entered Whale Bay, a pristine inlet surrounded by mountains that rose nearly 3,000 feet from the water's edge. The bay was perhaps 2 miles long and a mile wide, with several smaller coves branching off from the main body of water. Dense forests of spruce and hemlock covered the mountainsides, their dark green canopy broken occasionally by the golden yellow of cottonwoods in their autumn glory. Aaron reduced speed as they entered the bay, his eyes scanning the shoreline for any sign of bears. This was prime salmon spawning habitat, and the streams that fed into the bay would be thick with fish making their final journey upstream. Where there were salmon, there would inevitably be bears. "Look at the size of those jumpers," Scott said, pointing to several large salmon breaking the surface near the mouth of a creek. The fish were silver bright, fresh from the ocean and full of the energy that would carry them to their spawning grounds. Aaron maneuvered the boat toward a promising-looking spot, about 200 yards from shore, where his depth finder showed a gradual shelf dropping from 20 feet to nearly 60. This was the kind of structure that salmon used as a highway when moving between deep water and the streams where they would spawn. They anchored in 35 feet of water, the boat positioned so they could cast toward shore while maintaining enough distance to feel secure from any bears that might be fishing the same waters. Aaron had learned long ago that bears were excellent swimmers and could cover surprising distances in the water when motivated by food. The fishing was spectacular from the moment they got their lines wet. Scott hooked the first salmon, a bright coho that fought with the desperate strength of a fish that had traveled thousands of miles to reach this moment. The fish made several long runs, stripping line from his reel, before finally tiring enough for Aaron to net it. "Jesus, look at the shoulders on this thing," Aaron said, admiring the salmon's thick body and bright silver sides. "This is exactly what we came for." Over the next 2 hours, they caught and released more than a dozen salmon, keeping only the 2 largest for dinner. The fishing was so productive that they barely noticed the subtle changes taking place around them. The wind had shifted from southwest to southeast, bringing with it the kind of thick, low clouds that could reduce visibility to mere yards in a matter of minutes. Scott was changing lures when he noticed movement on the shoreline. At first, he thought it might be a deer or perhaps one of the island's feral cattle, but as the shape emerged from the forest, there was no mistaking the massive bulk and distinctive gait of a Kodiak brown bear. "Aaron," he said quietly, not wanting to make any sudden movements that might attract the animal's attention, "we've got company." Aaron looked up from his tackle box and immediately spotted the bear. It was a large male, probably weighing close to 800 pounds, with the distinctive shoulder hump and broad skull that marked it as a mature boar. The bear's chocolate-brown coat was thick with winter fur, and its massive paws left deep impressions in the muddy shoreline as it moved with surprising grace along the water's edge. "He's just fishing," Aaron said, though he immediately began reeling in his line. "But we should give him some space." The bear seemed unaware of their presence as it waded into the shallow water at the creek mouth, its attention focused entirely on the salmon that were staging there before making their final push upstream. The massive animal moved with the patience of a creature that had learned to wait for the right moment, its head held low as it watched for any sign of movement beneath the surface. Suddenly, with lightning-fast reflexes that seemed impossible for something so large, the bear lunged forward, its massive jaws closing around a salmon that had ventured too close. The fish, nearly 10 pounds of muscle and bone, disappeared in a single gulp, barely qualifying as a snack for an animal that needed to consume tens of thousands of calories each day. "Look at the size of that thing," Scott whispered, unconsciously lowering his voice even though they were well beyond the bear's hearing. "He's got to be pushing 1,000 pounds. Aaron started the engine, keeping the RPMs low to avoid making noise that might disturb the bear or attract its attention. The last thing they wanted was for the animal to associate their boat with food, either the salmon they'd caught or, in a worst-case scenario, themselves. The bear continued fishing for another 20 minutes, catching 3 more salmon with the same effortless efficiency. Each successful hunt was followed by a careful scan of the surrounding area. the bear's small but intelligent eyes taking in every detail of its environment. It was this constant vigilance that had allowed these animals to survive and thrive in one of the world's most challenging environments. "We should probably move to another spot," Aaron said, though he was reluctant to leave such productive fishing. "Let him have this area to himself," Scott nodded, already beginning to pack their gear. As much as he wanted to continue fishing, he'd learned from his father that the key to surviving in bear country was knowing when to yield ground. Bears, especially large males like this one, were generally tolerant of humans as long as they didn't feel threatened or challenged for resources. Aaron had just lifted the anchor when the bear's behavior changed. Instead of continuing to fish, it raised its massive head and looked directly at their boat, its ears forward and alert. For several long seconds, the two brothers and the bear regarded each other across the diminishing distance, each trying to assess the intentions of the other. The bear took a step deeper into the water, then another. Its movements were deliberate now, no longer the casual meandering of an animal focused on fishing. Aaron immediately increased the engine's throttle, putting more distance between the boat and the shore. "What's he doing?" Scott asked, though the answer was becoming increasingly obvious. The bear was moving toward them with purpose, its powerful swimming stroke carrying it steadily through the water. "I don't know," Aaron replied, his voice tight with concentration as he steered the boat toward the center of the bay. "Maybe he smells our fish." The salmon they'd kept were in a cooler at the back of the boat, but Aaron knew that a bear's sense of smell was 7 times more acute than a bloodhound's. If the wind was carrying their scent toward shore, the bear would have no trouble detecting the fish they'd caught. The bear was now 50 yards from shore and swimming steadily toward them. Its massive head rode high in the water, and its powerful front legs propelled it forward with strokes that sent ripples across the bay's surface. Aaron had seen bears swim before, but never with such obvious intent. "Aaron, he's gaining on us," Scott said, his voice carrying the first edge of real fear. The bear was perhaps 100 yards away now, and despite the boat's motor, the distance wasn't increasing as quickly as either man had hoped. Aaron pushed the throttle to its maximum setting, and the boat rose higher on plane, finally beginning to open some distance from their pursuer. The bear continued swimming for another 50 yards before apparently deciding that the chase was futile. It turned and began swimming back toward shore, its massive bulk moving through the water with the same grace it had displayed on land. "Jesus Christ," Scott breathed, watching the bear's retreat. "I've never seen anything like that." Aaron kept the boat at high speed until they'd cleared the bay entirely, only then reducing power and allowing his heart rate to return to something approaching normal. In 20 years of guiding clients through Alaska's wilderness, he'd had hundreds of encounters with bears, but he'd never been pursued in the water by one. "Maybe we should head back," Scott suggested, though his voice carried little conviction. They'd driven 4 hours to reach Kodiak and paid for a week's lodging. The idea of cutting their trip short after one unusual encounter with a bear went against everything their father had taught them about not letting fear control their decisions. "Let's try Karluk Lagoon," Aaron said after a moment's consideration. "It's more open water, and there are usually fewer bears there." Karluk Lagoon was located on the island's western shore, about an hour's run from their current position. It was a large, shallow body of water connected to the ocean by a narrow channel, famous for its silver salmon fishing and its relative lack of bear activity. The lagoon's open nature made it less attractive to bears, who preferred the cover and salmon concentrations found in smaller streams and rivers. The run to Karluk Lagoon took them along the island's exposed western coast, where the full power of the North Pacific had carved dramatic cliffs and sea stacks from the volcanic rock. The October weather was holding, with scattered clouds and moderate seas, but Aaron could see a more substantial weather system building on the western horizon. "Looks like we might get some weather later," he commented, gesturing toward the approaching clouds. We should probably plan on heading back by mid-afternoon." Scott checked his watch and noted that it was just past noon. They'd been on the water for nearly 4 hours, and his mother would be expecting their first check-in call soon. He pulled out the satellite communicator and sent a brief message confirming their location and status, along with their plan to fish Karluk Lagoon for the afternoon. The entrance to Karluk Lagoon was marked by a narrow channel, perhaps 50 yards wide, with shallow water on either side. Aaron reduced speed as they approached, watching his depth finder carefully to avoid the numerous sandbars that could trap an unwary boater at low tide. The lagoon itself was a vast expanse of shallow water, perhaps 3 miles long and 2 miles wide, surrounded by low hills covered in tundra vegetation. Unlike the dramatic mountain scenery of Whale Bay, this landscape had a subtle beauty, with golden grasses and low shrubs painted in the muted colors of autumn. "This is more like it," Scott said, appreciating the open visibility and lack of dense forest where bears might remain hidden until the last moment. "At least here we can see them coming." Aaron anchored the boat in the lagoon's center, where the water was deep enough to provide good salmon-holding areas while keeping them well away from any bears that might be fishing the inlet streams. The fishing here was different from Whale Bay, with smaller but more numerous salmon that attacked their lures with savage aggression. For the next 2 hours, they enjoyed the kind of fishing that Alaska was famous for, with steady action and spectacular scenery. The earlier encounter with the swimming bear began to feel like an anomaly, an unusual but not necessarily threatening interaction with the island's wildlife. It was Scott who first noticed the boat approaching from the direction of the lagoon's entrance. The vessel was smaller than theirs, perhaps 14 feet long, with a single occupant who was moving slowly along the shoreline as if searching for something. "Looks like another fisherman," Aaron observed, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun. "Maybe he can tell us how the fishing's been." As the boat drew closer, they could see that the operator was an older man, probably in his 60s, with the kind of weathered appearance that marked him as a local. He was scanning the shoreline intently, and when he spotted the Mitchell brothers, he immediately changed course and headed toward them. "You fellows see any bears today?" the man called out as he approached, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone who'd grown up speaking both English and Russian, common among Kodiak's older residents. "We had one swim toward us earlier in Whale Bay," Aaron replied. "Big male, probably 800 or 900 pounds. The man's expression grew serious. "That would be Ivan," he said, using the name locals had given to a particularly large and aggressive bear that had been causing problems around the island. "Fish and Wildlife's been tracking him. He's been getting too comfortable around boats and people." The man introduced himself as Dmitry Volkov, a third-generation Kodiak resident whose grandfather had been among the Russian settlers who'd remained on the island after the Alaska Purchase in 1867. Dmitry had been fishing these waters for more than 40 years and knew the local bear population as well as anyone. "Ivan's been hanging around the popular fishing spots for most of the season," Dmitry explained. "He's learned that boats mean fish, and he's not afraid of people anymore. Fish and Wildlife says they might have to relocate him or worse." The news was sobering. A bear that had lost its fear of humans was a dangerous bear, capable of escalating any encounter into a potentially fatal confrontation. The fact that this particular animal had been actively pursuing their boat suggested that the situation was even more serious than Dmitry indicated. "We were thinking about trying one more spot before heading back," Aaron said. "Any suggestions for somewhere Ivan's less likely to show up?" Dmitry considered for a moment before pointing toward the lagoon's northeastern shore. "There's a little cove about a mile that way, deeper water, good salmon holding area, and Ivan doesn't seem to like it there. Something about the way the wind swirls, maybe. Bears rely on their noses more than anything else." The brothers thanked Dmitri for the information and the warning, then watched as the older man continued his patrol along the shoreline. It was clear that the local fishing community was taking the Ivan situation seriously, and Aaron made a mental note to report their earlier encounter to Fish and Wildlife when they returned to town. The cove Dmitri had recommended proved to be everything he'd promised. Tucked into a fold of the lagoon's northeastern shore, it offered deep water close to shore and excellent salmon fishing. More importantly, it provided clear sight lines in all directions, making it impossible for any bears to approach without being spotted from a considerable distance. By 4 o'clock, they'd caught enough salmon to justify the entire trip, with 2 beautiful silver salmon in their cooler and memories of dozens more that they'd released. The weather was beginning to deteriorate as the system Aaron had spotted earlier moved closer to shore, bringing with it stronger winds and the promise of rain. "We should probably start thinking about heading back," Scott suggested, watching the approaching clouds with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years working on Alaska's North Slope. "This looks like it could get nasty." Aaron was preparing to agree when he noticed movement along the shoreline to their north. At first, he thought it might be Dmitri returning from his patrol, but as the shape resolved itself, he realized they were looking at another bear, this one even larger than the animal they'd encountered in Whale Bay. "There's no way," Scott said, following his brother's gaze. "That can't be the same bear." But as they watched, the massive animal began displaying the same purposeful behavior they'd witnessed earlier. Instead of fishing or foraging along the shore, it was moving directly toward the water's edge, its attention clearly focused on their boat. Aaron started the engine immediately, not waiting to see what the bear's intentions might be. The animal was still a quarter-mile away, but he'd learned earlier that bears could cover surprising distances in the water when motivated. The bear entered the water without hesitation, its massive bulk moving through the shallows with surprising speed. Unlike their earlier encounter, this bear seemed even more determined, swimming directly toward them, with powerful strokes that sent waves radiating across the lagoon's surface. "That's definitely Ivan," Scott said, his voice tight with tension. "And he's not giving up this time." Aaron pushed the throttle to maximum, and the boat leaped forward, throwing a spray of water behind them as they accelerated toward the lagoon's entrance. The bear continued its pursuit, but the greater distance and the boat's higher speed seemed to be keeping them ahead of their massive pursuer. They were halfway to the lagoon's entrance when the engine began to sputter. Aaron felt his heart sink as the motor's steady rhythm faltered, then caught, then faltered again. He immediately reduced throttle, hoping to nurse the engine along, but the damage was apparently already done. "What's wrong?" Scott asked, though the answer was obvious from the engine's increasingly erratic behavior. "I don't know," Aaron replied, his voice tight with concentration as he tried to coax more power from the failing motor. "Could be water in the fuel, could be a clogged filter." The engine gave one final cough and died completely, leaving them drifting in the lagoon's center with only the sound of wind and waves for company. Aaron immediately moved to the stern and began troubleshooting, checking fuel lines and connections, while Scott kept watch on the approaching bear. "Aaron, he's gaining fast," Scott reported, his voice carrying an edge of panic. "Maybe 200 yards and closing." Aaron's hands flew over the engine's components, checking everything he could think of while precious seconds ticked away. The bear was now clearly visible, its massive head cutting through the water as it swam steadily toward them with the persistence of a guided missile. "Try the emergency motor," Scott suggested, referring to the small trolling motor they carried as backup. Aaron quickly deployed the electric motor, but its limited power was clearly insufficient for their current situation. The bear was now less than 100 yards away and closing fast, its small but intelligent eyes fixed on their boat with unwavering determination. "It's not going to be enough," Aaron said, abandoning the trolling motor and returning to work on the main engine. "Keep trying to raise someone on the radio." Scott grabbed the VHF radio and began transmitting on Channel 16, the international distress frequency. "Mayday, mayday, this is fishing vessel Seahawk. We are disabled in Karluk Lagoon with a large bear approaching our position. Request immediate assistance." The radio crackled with static, but no response came. They were in a remote location, well beyond the range of most Coast Guard stations, and the deteriorating weather was probably affecting radio propagation. The bear was now 50 yards away, close enough for them to see the water streaming from its massive shoulders as it swam. Its eyes were locked on their boat, and there was something in its expression that suggested this was not merely curiosity, but something far more dangerous. Aaron made one final attempt to start the engine, and to his immense relief, it caught and held. He immediately pushed the throttle forward, and the boat lurched ahead, opening distance from the pursuing bear. But their relief was short-lived. The engine was clearly running rough, missing and surging in a way that suggested it might quit again at any moment. Aaron nursed it along, trying to maintain enough speed to stay ahead of the bear, while not pushing it so hard that it failed completely. They were nearing the lagoon's entrance when disaster struck. The engine gave a final shudder and died completely, leaving them drifting in the narrow channel that connected the lagoon to the open ocean. The bear, which had fallen behind during their brief escape, renewed its pursuit with apparent determination. "The anchor," Aaron said, grabbing the heavy Danforth anchor from the bow. "If he gets to the boat, we use this." Scott nodded grimly, understanding that they were now in a fight for their lives. The bear was 30 yards away and closing fast, its massive bulk moving through the water with the relentless power of a freight train. 20 yards, 15, 10. The bear reached their boat and immediately began trying to climb aboard, its massive front paws gripping the aluminum gunnel with claws that could tear through metal. The boat tilted dangerously under the animal's weight, water sloshing over the side as the bear attempted to haul itself aboard. Aaron swung the anchor with all his strength, striking the bear in the shoulder. The animal roared in pain and anger, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself, but it didn't release its grip on the boat. Scott grabbed a paddle and joined the fight, striking the bear repeatedly across its massive skull, while Aaron continued swinging the anchor. The boat was taking on water now, tilting further and further as the bear's weight threatened to capsize them completely. The bear's massive jaws snapped at Scott, missing his arm by inches as he pulled back just in time. The animal's eyes held an intelligence that was somehow more terrifying than simple animal rage, as if it understood exactly what it was doing and was enjoying the struggle. With a final, tremendous effort, the bear hauled its front quarters over the gunwale, its massive weight causing the boat to list dangerously to starboard. Water poured over the side as the vessel's stability reached its breaking point. Aaron brought the anchor down on the bear's skull with every ounce of strength he possessed, and for a moment the animal seemed stunned. But instead of retreating, it seemed to become even more enraged, its massive paws batting at both men with swipes that could have easily broken bones. The boat capsized with shocking suddenness, throwing both brothers into the frigid water along with their massive attacker. The 40-degree water hit them like a physical blow, driving the breath from their lungs and immediately beginning the process of hypothermia that would kill them in minutes if they couldn't get out. Aaron surfaced first, gasping for air and immediately looking for his brother. Scott's head appeared 10 feet away, his face already pale from the cold shock and his breathing rapid and shallow. The bear surfaced between them, its massive bulk even more imposing in the water than it had been on land. It seemed confused by the sudden change in circumstances, turning its massive head from one brother to the other, as if trying to decide which presented the greater threat. "The boat!" Aaron gasped, pointing to their overturned vessel, which was floating about 20 feet away. "We have to get to the boat." Both men began swimming toward their only chance of survival, but the bear was faster and more comfortable in the water. It reached Scott first, its massive jaws closing around his life jacket and dragging him under the surface. Scott disappeared beneath the dark water, and for several terrifying seconds, Aaron thought his brother was gone forever. Then Scott's head broke the surface again, blood streaming from deep gashes on his scalp, where the bear's claws had raked him. Aaron reached the overturned boat and managed to grab hold of the keel, using it to pull himself partially out of the water. From this position, he could see Scott struggling weakly in the water 30 feet away, clearly in shock from blood loss and hypothermia. The bear was circling now, its massive head moving back and forth between the two brothers like a predator, trying to decide which prey to take first. The water around Scott was turning red with blood, and Aaron knew that his brother didn't have much time left. Without thinking, Aaron released his grip on the boat and began swimming toward his brother, knowing that he was probably swimming to his own death but unable to abandon Scott. The bear saw his movement and immediately changed course, its powerful strokes carrying it on an intercept course. Aaron reached Scott just as the bear arrived, and for a moment all three were clustered together in the frigid water. The bear's massive jaws opened, revealing teeth the size of railroad spikes, and Aaron knew that this was how it would end. But instead of attacking, the bear seemed to pause, as if something had distracted it. Aaron followed the animal's gaze and saw a boat approaching at high speed, its engine roaring as it bounced across the lagoon's waves. Dmitry Volkov had heard their mayday call and was racing to their assistance, his smaller boat flying across the water as he pushed his engine to its limits. The old Russian was shouting something, but his words were lost in the sound of wind and waves. The bear, apparently deciding that the approaching boat represented a new threat, released its grip on Scott and began swimming toward shore. Aaron managed to get an arm around his barely conscious brother and began the desperate struggle to keep both of them afloat until help could arrive. Dmitry's boat reached them within minutes that felt like hours, and the old fisherman immediately began hauling both men aboard with strength that belied his age. Scott was unconscious now, his face grey with blood loss and hypothermia, while Aaron was barely able to assist in his own rescue. "Hospital!" Aaron gasped as Dmitry pulled him into the boat. "He needs a hospital!" Dmitry was already turning his boat toward shore, pushing his engine to its maximum as he raced toward the distant harbor. He grabbed his radio and began calling for medical assistance, his voice calm and professional despite the emergency. The trip back to Kodiak seemed to take forever, with Scott drifting in and out of consciousness while Aaron applied pressure to his brother's wounds with towels from Dmitry's emergency kit. The old Russian pushed his boat harder than it had ever been pushed, taking risks with shoals and rocks that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. They reached the harbor just as the emergency medical team was arriving, and Scott was immediately transferred to a waiting ambulance. Aaron, suffering from hypothermia and shock, but otherwise uninjured, was taken to the hospital for observation and treatment. Scott Mitchell survived his encounter with Ivan, though he spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from his injuries and the effects of hypothermia. The bear attack left him with permanent scars and a profound respect for the power of Alaska's wildlife, but it didn't diminish his love for the wilderness that had nearly killed him. Ivan the bear was eventually tracked down and relocated to a remote area of the Alaska Peninsula, far from any human activity. Wildlife biologists hoped that the relocation would break his association between boats and food, allowing him to return to his natural behavior patterns. The Mitchell brothers' boat was never recovered, presumably sunk in the deep water near Karluk Lagoon's entrance. They returned to fishing the following season in a new boat equipped with redundant safety systems and emergency beacons, but they never again ventured into bear country without multiple escape plans. The incident became part of Kodiak Island folklore, a reminder of the thin line between civilization and wilderness that exists throughout Alaska. It reinforced the importance of respecting the island's massive brown bears and the need for constant vigilance when sharing their territory. Years later, Aaron would still wake up some nights with the memory of Ivan's intelligent eyes staring at him across the dark water, a reminder that in Alaska, humans are always visitors in someone else's home. The experience had changed both brothers, giving them a deeper appreciation for the power and unpredictability of the natural world they loved so much. Scott eventually returned to his job on the North Slope, but he never forgot the lesson learned in Karluk Lagoon. Alaska demands respect, and those who forget that fact do so at their own peril. The wilderness that gives so much can take everything away in an instant, and survival often depends on the kindness of strangers like Dmitry Volkov, who risk their own lives to save others. The story of the Mitchell brothers and Ivan the bear became a cautionary tale told in fishing lodges and harbor bars throughout Alaska, a reminder that even experienced outdoorsmen can find themselves at the mercy of forces beyond their control. It reinforced the fundamental truth that in Alaska, nature always has the final word.